Hello there, and welcome to the planet's memory, where curiosity finds a gentle pace and science is allowed to wander without hurry, like a tide that takes its time returning to the shore, like a thought that lingers and doesn't need to arrive anywhere too soon. Tonight, we're going to drift slowly into a question that feels simple at first, but grows like a coastline the longer we follow it. What if continents remember dust? And what if dust remembers everything that made us possible? Not because stones write in words, not because sand can speak in sentences, but because matter keeps a kind of quiet pattern that lasts longer than any map, a long patience held in minerals, in layers, in the soft arithmetic of isotopes changing their minds grain by grain. Before we step forward, if it's comfortable, notice where this meets you tonight. In a room where the air is still, near a window where the night carries a cool scent, or somewhere far from the sea where the ocean feels like a memory someone else had first. Maybe the question seems too large to carry, and that's all right. We will let the question carry us instead, step by unhurried step. We begin at a scale too fine for eyes, where dust floats in the faint light and chooses, without choosing, to fall together. We picture a young cloud of matter circling a young star, a slow gathering in a slow wind, where small things become slightly larger things, and those become something that might be called a world. Not because the universe planned it, but because gravity is patient and heat is a careful editor, melting and sorting and asking matter to find its place. In that slow sorting, iron slips inward like a secret kept close, and lighter silicates rise like a breath that won't be denied, and something like a crust forms. Not a continent yet, but a promise of one, a raft in rehearsal. Could it be that this is where memory begins, not in mind but in arrangement, not in thought but in the layered logic of elements learning how to live together? We follow the warmth as it ebbs and rises again, the way a planet cools but never truly sleeps, and in that cooling, tiny crystals hold the temperature of a vanished morning the way a seashell holds a distant echo. There are zircons small enough to sit on the edge of a single hair, carrying within them a clock that does not forget, a ratio of atoms that changes with time like a candle melting down to the lesson it was meant to give. Is it possible that in these crystals the planet keeps a diary, not in words we can speak, but in numbers that refuse to lie, numbers that say, there was water here, there was heat here, there was the beginning of land here. We lean close to these ancient sparks not because they are loud, but because they are quiet, and quiet things are often the truest about long stories. As the crust thickens in places, like dough that has found yeast, as patches of silica-rich rock learn to float higher than the basaltic seas, something like a continent practices standing. Not a sudden arrival, not a heroic leap, but a decades of millions of years unfolding that feels more like breathing than building. We imagine the first cratons, old hearts of land, drifting in a mantle that moves in slow, warm currents, the way heavy air moves across a room you only notice when a candle flickers. The continents are rafts of memory in an ocean of heat. They are the long result of dust deciding to stay together a little longer than expected. Maybe memory is this, a willingness to remain. We walk along a shore that is older than the word shore, minds unhurried, and think about erosion as a gentle teacher. Mountains do not fall because they are weak. They become sand because rivers are patient, wind is faithful, ice is careful with its work. The fallen grains do not vanish. They collect in deltas and shelves, where pressure and time make them stone again, and then, with a different turn of the planet's breath, those stones rise as mountains once more. We sense a loop here, a calm, persistent loop where losing is a form of keeping, where decay is a way matter learns new shapes. What if identity is not a solid block but a cycle of arrangements, each as true as the last, each remembering in a different voice? We look for the tracks that time leaves behind and find them in ratios of oxygen and carbon, in the soft bones of forgotten fish turned to stone, in the fragile imprints of leaves pressed into mud that hardened into a calm archive. Not because fossils freeze a moment, but because they reveal a pattern of survival and silence, a story of endings that made space for other beginnings to try their chance. Could it be that continents do not merely carry life, but learn from it, storing forms and failures and second chances the way a forest stores its own shade? Maybe, or maybe continents only carry, and carrying is enough. And somewhere deep beneath our feet, where light never visits, slabs of ocean floor bend and bow and slip downward into warmer dark, releasing water that helps new magma rise, which cools and adds another thin page to the book of land. We think about subduction not as a violent end, but as a return to a workshop where the planet edits itself with a slow hand. We think about entropy not as a thief, but as a tide, always pulling things apart, yes, but always leaving room for quiet structures to hold a while longer. Not because order wins, but because some patterns are content to linger before letting go. We wonder, softly, how much a continent remembers of the sky it wore, the winds that carved it, the seas that pressed their shapes into its edges and then retreated. We wonder if the atmosphere leaves its accent in the rocks, a hint of an older air held in mineral cages, a faint taste of rain that fell when no birds were there to feel it. Is it possible the planet keeps these flavors tucked away not as trophies, but as recipes for future weather, future forests, future shores that we cannot yet imagine? Maybe, maybe not. And that uncertainty feels like a door we are not asked to open tonight. We return to dust, because we promise to the tiny, ordinary fragments that drift across rooms and deserts and oceans, settling on everything with equal grace. Dust is not an ending. Dust is an invitation. In the long arithmetic of time, dust learns to become rock, rock learns to become continent, continent learns to carry life, and life learns to look back and ask how any of this could be. Not because we need certainty, but because wonder is a place we can rest. And if continents remember dust, even a little, then perhaps we, gathered here in the quiet, can remember with them that we came from small things that decided to stay close, that we are held together by patient forces we barely feel, that nothing important is ever rushed. We will keep asking the gentle questions because gentle questions have a way of leading on without demanding answers. And as we drift toward what comes next, we can let the thoughts settle like soft weather over a sleeping field. If memory can last this long in stone, what other promises might still be kept in the deep, warm dark below, waiting to lift a new shore into the light? So we drift backward now, farther than maps and farther than mountains, to a colder brightness and a thinner dust, to a cloud that was not yet a world but had already begun to gather its thoughts. Hello there, and welcome back to the planet's memory, where we walk slowly on the edge of sleep and let science take the long route it deserves. We picture the solar nebula as a hush of particles, ash from older stars suspended in a turning silence, each grain a tiny vote for the future. Not because a plan was written, but because gravity is a kind of patience that works without an argument, and because collisions, though gentle at first, add up like footsteps on a long road. In that turning cloud, small things meet and hold. They do not hold perfectly, and they do not hold forever, but often enough that little clumps become pebbles, and pebbles become stones, and stones become something no hand could lift. The cold keeps them brittle. Then the collisions make them warm, and warmth allows the softer edges to stick. Could it be that accretion is a quiet choreography, a slow dance where entropy loosens its grip just long enough for structure to try a shape? Maybe, maybe not. And yet the evidence rests in the chemistry of what followed, in the heat that rose from within as bodies grew, in the way metals traveled inward and lighter minerals drifted up like breath after sleep. What if the first lesson Earth learned was simply this: gather, warm, separate, and remember each step by the patterns it leaves behind? We imagine a world the size of a thought becoming the size of a promise, its center sinking heavy and bright, its mantle thick like a patient tide. Iron listens to the pull and goes inward. Silicate minerals rise and spread like quiet light across a dim surface. Not because anything meant to be beautiful, but because density has always been a soft law written into matter. We can almost hear the young planet sorting itself by temperature and weight, the way a slow river sorts sand from silt along a gentle bend. Is it possible that in those first melting pools the crust rehearsed for continents? Thin at first, dark and basaltic like cooled night, while pockets of lighter, silica-rich melt collected, trying out the buoyancy that would one day teach land to float? As heat retreats in waves and returns in pulses, as impacts spark then fade, the surface thickens and breaks and thickens again, a mosaic of plates before plates had names. Radioactive elements whisper their steady warmth into the mantle, and convection begins as barely a stir, a breath moving through rocks slower than a heartbeat in sleep. Where the skin of Earth cracks, magma wells up and spreads. Where it cools, it forms new crust, and where it is heavy, it sinks back down. Not because the planet chooses, but because balance is always looking for itself in the dark. Here, in this patient adjustment, we can see the first hint of rafts forming protocontinents with just enough lightness, just enough thickness, to float higher than their basalt seas. We lean closer to the chemistry that records these early trials, to isotope trails like fingerprints left in cooling glass. Hafnium and neodymium carry clues about the age of separated melts. Oxygen in tiny zircons tells us water touched hot rock, while the world was still young enough to be surprised by oceans. What if these ratios are not just numbers but the planet's handwriting, the way a diary might keep the feel of a day long after the day is gone? We hold the pages gently, counting not years but half-lives, feeling how decay becomes information, how entropy, even as it unravels, tucks meaning into the thread. And then we let our minds stretch to the scale of the calm violence of time, where impacts arrive like brief thunder and then the long hush returns. Each collision stirs the mantle, shakes the crust, resets a clock somewhere inside the stone. Could it be that continents are the quiet survivors of a buoyant lesson repeated over and over? Float if you can, thicken if you must, endure by being lighter than what would take you under? The rule is simple, the path is not. Pieces join and part, ridges rise and cool, and somewhere a thicker patch lifts above a basalt plain like a slow island, not born in a moment but found in a sequence of conditions that finally agreed. We watch, softly, as this young surface learns a rhythm. Outflow and inflow, creation and return. New crust made at spreading centers, old crust surrendered to deeper heat. The word for it comes later, subduction, but the act is already there, teaching the mantle to breathe, teaching the crust to travel. Where plates meet and one gives way, water rides down and sets the stage for melting that feeds lighter magmas, adding small contributions to a continental seed. Not because the planet prefers land, but because the physics of water and pressure and temperature favor certain paths, and those paths, walked for long enough, arrive at rafts that do not sink. We move our thought like a low lantern over the surface, noticing the first rain and the first oceans keeping company with the first granitic fragments, each shaping the other with quiet insistence. Atmosphere forms and reforms as volcanoes exhale and impacts inhale. Weather begins its long, soft work of turning height into history. If the sky leaves its accent in rocks, if the oceans leave their salt in crystals, if time leaves its reflection in half-lives, then continents become libraries shelved by buoyancy and dust. Not because memory is mystical, but because structure itself, repeated and preserved, becomes a kind of remembering that outlasts names. We are patient with this slowness because slowness is the honest speed of worlds. Pebble to rock, rock to planetesimal, planetesimal to protoplanet, and then a sphere that glows inside with the careful fire of decay. Perhaps identity, for a planet, is simply how it keeps its patterns against the pressure of forgetting. Perhaps continents are not a single invention but many small agreements. Composition agreeing with heat, heat agreeing with motion, motion agreeing with the lightness of silica-rich crust. Maybe, maybe not. And our not knowing is a soft place to rest, the kind of uncertainty that does not unsettle sleep. And as the world continues to turn, as gravity's gentle net holds everything close while still allowing drift, we feel the next question arrive the way a tide arrives, without hurry, without need for permission. If the net can gather dust into worlds and worlds into continents, if buoyancy can teach rock to float and memory can live in ratios and scars, then what other lessons linger in the stone, waiting to be read by those who listen slowly? And if a crust can learn to stand, what taught it to endure? What quiet engine beneath our feet keeps the rafts moving across their warm, unseen sea, inviting them onward, inviting us to follow? We arrive inside the warmth we could only imagine before, where the young world glowed from within, and the question we carried begins to take a sharper, softer shape. If buoyancy taught rock to float, what instructed fire to sort the stones so patiently that a planet could find its layers and keep them? We move through the Hadean like a slow drift through a dim red room, not because anything is rushing us, but because the story is slow and the heat itself is telling it in long sentences of melt and weight and cooling breath. Iron knows where to go without a map. It listens to gravity's steady invitation and sinks, not out of urgency, but out of agreement with what it is. Lighter silicates rise as if remembering a promise to the surface, lifting into a first skin that is not yet land as we know it. But it is skin all the same, a crust that cools and cracks and mends and learns. Could it be that memory begins here? Not in minds, not in language, but in the way matter accepts its place, with enough time to turn acceptance into pattern? We let the core form in our imagination, a sphere within a sphere, bright with the hush of pressure. Then the mantle above it, heavy and slow like a patient tide, and on top the crust, thin and changing, a stage that keeps being rebuilt between scenes. Not because some designer drew it, but because density is a kind law and heat moves outward, and every element has a comfort it will return to when given the chance. The early crust is dark and basaltic, a cooled night poured over a warmer day, broken by impacts that remelt and remix, erased and rewritten, again and again, until the script begins to hold. In places, where water finds a way to the hot edge of rock and lowers the melting point, where pressure and chemistry lean toward something lighter, small pockets of silica-rich melt gather. They rise slowly, they cool slowly, they harden into seeds of something buoyant, something stubborn against the weight of the mantle below. Not land, not yet, but a rehearsal for it, thicker and lighter than the floors of the early oceans. A first draft of continents whispered into existence by partial melting. We picture proto-continents as quiet rafts in a sea of basalt, not because the planet prefers them, but because the physics of their birth makes them hard to drown. The mantle moves underneath like a conversation that never ends, carrying heat from within toward the surface in slow, looping words. Where that heat breaks the skin, new rock arrives. Where the skin grows heavy, rock returns downward, and each return leaves a trace. Each ascent leaves a signature, as if the world were signing its name again and again with molten ink. Is it possible that the earliest granitic fragments were lessons the planet taught itself? Thicken to save yourself, lighten to keep your place, endure by floating? Maybe, maybe not. And the uncertainty is gentle, like fog that softens the distance without hiding the path. If we want to know whether this sifting truly happened, we can listen to the tiny timekeepers that survive the noise. Zircons, no bigger than a grain hid in light, hold ratios that drift at a steady pace, little clocks whose numbers count not minutes but ages. In their oxygen we taste old water touching hot rock. In their hafnium and lead we hear stories about crust separating from mantle, while the planet was still a young ember in a cooling hand. Not because crystals choose to remember, but because their structure keeps a record of what passed through it, and decay, which seems like loss, becomes information when read in calm. We hold one such crystal in our mind and ask, what if this is the handwriting of fire, faint but legible, telling us that dust did not only gather, it learned to become something that could last? We move slowly through the possibility that the earliest land was an archipelago of trials, appearing and vanishing, thinned by impacts, thickened by chance, a patchwork stitched together by heat and time. We think of entropy not as a villain but as the weather of the universe, always working, always loosening, and yet within it, eddies of order hold a while, like leaves circling in a small current even as the river flows on. The core cools a fraction, the mantle circulates, the crust fractures, and in the cracks magma rises and cools, a breath the world practices for billions of years. Could it be that endurance is not a single act, but a style of repeating form made, unmade, remade, until the pattern is strong enough to resist the next forgetfulness? We pause at the edges where ocean meets that first thicker rock and feel how water, even then, was a collaborator with heat. Water slips down with subducting slabs and changes the melting point below. It frees lighter magmas that climb and gather into bodies that will someday cohere into continental hearts. Not because water is purposeful, but because its presence bends the rules just enough to allow new shapes to happen. Each ascent leaves behind minerals that speak of pressure and depth. Each cooling leaves textures that whisper speed and calm, telling geologists, much later, which story to read in which stone. This is how silence becomes a kind of voice. In the arrangement, in the layering, in the faint lines that were never erased. Above, the young air is finding itself, thick with the breath of volcanoes, thin with the absence of what life will one day give it, changing and changing again as impacts add and winds remove. The sky leaves its tone in the rocks through oxidation states, through tiny inclusions that hold a taste of an ancient atmosphere, through colors that do not fade. We wonder if the planet senses its own weather through these marks, a body remembering the seasons of its childhood long after it has grown. Maybe it does, or maybe we are the ones who remember for it, reading the isotope trails like quiet margin notes, grateful that decay keeps time when nothing else will. As the heat sorts and the stone obeys, the outcome is not a single event but a long arrangement, a slow stacking of dreams into core, mantle, crust. Even the word crust feels fragile, like something that could crack beneath a footstep, and yet it floats, and yet it lasts. The proto-continents do not shout. They persist. They thicken where collisions press them. They rise where lightness favors them. They drift on a mantle that will carry them farther than any mountain can see. Dust found form here, and the form learned to endure by being just buoyant enough, just patient enough, to ride the warm currents without surrendering its edges. We stay with this thought as if warming our hands over a slow fire. The planet did not rush, and so the pattern had time to set. If identity, in rock, is the ability to return to a shape after being disturbed, then these early granitic seeds were identity beginning, a rehearsal for continents, a memory that could be carried across disasters without collapsing. And we might ask, softly, what else was carried forward in those seeds? What flavors of ancient rain? What record of forgotten epochs? What hints of pressure and quiet storms are still folded inside them, waiting for someone to listen? And as the glow of the Hadean dims in our minds, as the sorting goes on without us needing to watch every moment, another question finds us as gently as sleep finds a tired room. If fire could stack a world into layers and teach light rock to float, what slow engine kept these rafts moving after they learned to stand? What warm, unseen rivers below began to tug at the undersides of continents, inviting them to wander, inviting rivers and fossils and futures to follow? Maybe the answer is already rising, like a long, low thunder from within, and maybe we are ready to hear it, one calm breath at a time. We follow that breath into something impossibly small and impossibly patient, a crystal no wider than a whisper, a shard of brightness that learned to keep time by letting go of it slowly. Zircons are not dramatic. They are steady. They form where silicate melts cool enough to arrange themselves with care. They survive where other minerals surrender to heat and weather, and inside their lattice a few atoms are invited that will quietly change, not because they want to, but because decay is a gentle law that turns presence into counting. In these tiny rooms of stone, uranium begins as itself and ends as lead, and that ending is not a loss. It is a record, a clock that cannot be hurried any more than dawn can be pulled closer by wish. We hold one in our mind as if it were a lantern bead, and the darkness of the Hadean and Archean years draws back a little, just enough to show there was water where we had only guessed. There was crust where we thought only oceanic night. There was a conversation between rock and rain long before anything like us could listen. The ratios carry temperatures like small fires carried in cupped hands. The oxygen tells of water's fingerprint pressed into hot surfaces. The hafnium hums of crust born from mantle, separated out like light from a deeper glow. Not because crystals think, but because structure remembers. What if memory is not an invention of animals but a property of patterns, kept best by those who do not hurry? Could it be that the planet's earliest mornings are still present in these sparks? That a grain found in a riverbed today is a window left unlatched by 4 billion winters and summers that forgot everything except how to keep this window open? We imagine the journey that would carry such a crystal into our hands. Born in a melt that cooled slow enough to be careful, folded into a rock that rose or sank and rose again, freed by erosion that turned height into history and carried by streams that murmur old stories to anyone who has time to listen. Mountains unstitched, deltas sown, sediments laid down in quiet layers, pressure and warmth turning them into stone. Then uplift, then weather, then the long walk in a river's pocket. Not because the world owes us specimens, but because cycles keep moving, and in the movement some small things endure. Zircons are stubborn in a kind way. They resist dissolution. They resist heat that would wipe their pages clean. Maybe endurance is a softer quality than we think. Less a wall against change and more a willingness to carry a message through it. We lean closer to the way these messages become numbers, and the numbers become years, and the years become scenes we cannot see but can almost feel. Rain hissing on hot rock, steam laying a veil over a young sky, oceans pooling in basins that will later be swallowed and remade, silica-rich melts gathering beneath volcanoes that are long since ground to sand. Is it possible that counting deep time is not cold at all but tender, that each half-life is like a heartbeat in stone, slow enough to be mistaken for silence? We listen to that silence and find it full. In the isotope trails, entropy is not the enemy. It is the metronome. Decay writes in disappearing ink that leaves a durable trace, the paradox we live by: to become a record, something has to change. And while we hold one crystal, we remember there are many, scattered across shield rocks and tundra soils, sifted from sands that run like hourglasses of entire continents. Each one is a local truth, and together they become a gentle chorus. Water early, crust early, recycling early, the planet learning and relearning how to keep its light rocks above its dark ones. Not because continents were inevitable, but because enough conditions repeated themselves to make buoyancy into a habit. If habits are a kind of memory, then zircons are where those habits announce themselves with a soft clearing of the throat. We read their ratios like we read the grain of old wood, knowing the rings that remain are not all the rings that ever were, but enough to feel the life that passed through. In rooms where microscopes glow like small moons, people bend close and let their breathing slow, and a thin laser touches a crystal, and in the vapor there is a calendar. We think about the patient hands that learn this work, the steady eyes, the curiosity that refuses to hurry, and we realize the act of reading is also a kind of remembering. The crystal keeps time, but we keep faith with it. Could it be that science itself is a form of care, an agreement with the past that we will listen even when the voice is faint? Maybe, maybe not. And the not knowing is welcome, because it leaves space for wonder to sit beside evidence and share the same quiet chair. Outside the laboratory, rivers keep sifting mountains, winds keep polishing plains, glaciers keep rehearsing the long syllables of ice, and in all of this motion the little survivors keep riding along. A zircon can outlast the rock that birthed it, the basin that held it, the ridge that lifted it, the climate that weathered it, outlast even the names we give to the epochs that trimmed or stretched the margins of shorelines. It is a small defiance against forgetfulness, and yet it does not brag. It just keeps account. What if our own memories could be this calm? Less a story we insist upon and more a pattern we maintain, even as we change. We turn the crystal again and again in thought, and each turn suggests another question we are not required to answer. If a mineral can hold the taste of ancient rain, what might the ocean floor hold in its own faint scripts before it disappears beneath a continent's edge? If dust can learn to count, could continents learn to listen, holding not only the fossils of bones and shells, but the energies and absences of forgotten atmospheres, the pauses between storms, the quiet after a long wind? Is it possible that the world's truest archives are not the loud cliffs, but the small, overlooked grains that endure in their simplicity? And if one spark of zircon can stretch a line through 4 billion years and find us here, tonight, it may be enough to rest with the idea that dust was never merely dust. It was a ledger, a delicate engine, a light that refuses to go out in a room that is always dimming and brightening by turns. We do not need to finish the thought. We only need to set it beside the next one. Like stones along a path we will walk slowly. Because if a crystal can keep time this way, then somewhere below, in the warm, dark currents we cannot see, the echoes that move continents must also be keeping time, inviting the rafts to drift, inviting us to follow that quiet pull into the deeper story waiting beneath our feet. We left the last thought resting in a small, bright grain, a zircon holding for billion quiet years, and from that spark we widen our view to something larger and slower, the way a camera drifts from a candle to the shape of a house around it. We meet the Kraton here, not as a headline, but as a long-held breath beneath our feet, an ancient heart inside each continent that refuses to hurry, refuses to yield, refuses to forget the lesson of buoyancy learned when the world was still young. Not because rock can will itself into strength, but because composition and cooling and time together make a keel thick, cool, and dry, that the mantle's warm hands cannot easily pull down. We picture this keel like the spine of a sleeping animal, curved and calm, with younger bones gathered around it, a body made possible by a quiet center that holds. We walk across shield country in our minds, The exposed heads of cratons where soil thins and the old crystalline rocks breathe evening light, and we notice how little they ask for and how much they offer. Granulites and gneisses show their banded histories in calm, muted colors. Metamorphic textures whisper of pressures endured without breaking. Isotopes in their minerals hold the memory of early crust that was melted, reset, and made stable, not once, but again and again, until stability became character. Could it be that endurance is not hardness alone, but dryness and coolness and depth combined? A recipe that keeps the keel from reacting, keeps it from being recycled into the mantle's appetite? Maybe not. And still the evidence rests in the thickness beneath, in the seismic maps that show a route extending down like an anchor, in the way heat flow runs low across these regions, as if the planet exhaled here long ago and never had to draw a hurried breath again. We listen for the story of how such a spine is stitched, and we hear collisions speaking in mountain belts now worn to soft hills, in sutures where different terrains met and learned each other's weight. The early world tried many combinations. Island arcs docking onto protocontinents, microcontinents accreting like small boats tying up to a larger hull, magmas intruding and cooling into plutons that would someday stand as granite ridges when everything softer washed away. Not because the planet aimed for permanence, but because repetition favors the patterns that survive. In each collision, crust thickened and warmed, then cooled. In each long cooling, minerals settled into stronger arrangements. In each stronger arrangement, the keel grew denser at depth, lighter above, more resistant to both the pull from below and the teeth of weather above. The spine did not appear, it accumulated, it learned, it set. Around this keel, younger crust gathered like rings in a tree of stone, as volcanic arcs added their lavas and sediments poured in from rising ranges. Rivers wrote long sentences across the margins, delivering ground mountains to the feet of the old heart, and the old heart accepted them without protest, letting the edges grow wide and varied while its center remained serene. Is it possible that identity, for a continent, is the promise that its oldest core will keep the time while the edges experiment with form? We can see it in maps. Stable shields at the center, mobile belts around them, shelves beyond that breathe with sea level and climate. The craton does not lead. It endures, and endurance makes leadership unnecessary. We step inside the keel with our imaginations the way seismic waves do, bouncing and bending through layers, and the echoes show a mantle lithosphere that is thicker here than elsewhere, cool enough to be strong, depleted in the fusible parts that might have made it soft. That depletion is its armor. What could melt has already melted, long ago, and what remains resists. Not because it is invulnerable, nothing is, but because its best chances to be undone have already passed. In this quiet, fossils ride the younger rocks at the edges. The core itself holds different archives. Isotope trails that point to early partitioning of crust and mantle, xenoliths carried up by later magmas that reveal peridotite cooled to a calm, diamond-bearing pressure. We realize that even diamonds are a kind of patience. Carbon kept safe in the keel's deep stillness until the planet's breathing lifts them close enough for us to guess. We give a moment to the surface, where weather never sleeps, and notice how the oldest rocks accept the slow abrasion without complaint. Entropy is always at work, softening ridges, widening valleys, turning blocks to grains, and yet here the sink is shallow. There is nowhere for this core to go but into sand that drapes and is lifted and stripped again in long cycles. Loss is not absence here. Loss becomes texture, and texture becomes a way to remember. Could it be that the craton's quiet is what lets life find calm ground between upheavals? A place where forests can take root through many climates, where rivers commit to their courses for longer spans, where forgotten epochs leave subtle but legible marks. Maybe not. And the humility of not insisting keeps the room gentle for sleep. We think about the times the world pressed hard against these cores, when supercontinents gathered and rent, when heat pooled beneath and tried to soften the keel from below, when mantle plumes rose like slow lanterns through the dark, and still the craton largely remained, flexing, fracturing at its margins, giving up pieces, taking new ones, but holding the center. Stability is not a refusal to change. It is a way of changing that keeps the shape. The continents breathe through their shelves, they sing through their mountains, but they lean on their cratons the way a body leans on bone. And bones, even in silence, keep stories long after flesh has gone. We stand at twilight on an imaginary shield, where the air tastes clean and old rain has left thin salt lines on sunlit stone, and acknowledge that this view is an accident we are allowed to witness. Deep time does not rush. It does not perform for us. It keeps working while we sleep, turning heat to motion, motion to fracture, fracture to assembly, and across all of it the keel is a steady syllable, a vowel held for eons so the rest of the word can change around it. What if our own memory could be so kind? Less a tight grip on details and more a generous structure that lets new days attach without breaking the whole. The Kraton shows how: be thick, be cool, be patient, be porous enough to accept additions, be strong enough to keep a center. If we listen closely enough, the Kraton's quiet spine points us toward the engine that keeps every addition and erosion in conversation. The warm circulation that tugs at the underside of keels and guides the rafts above the slowest tide on Earth. We do not have to hurry into that story. It is already simmering below, a low thunder we can feel through our feet if we let the night be still. And yet, as steady as this heart may be, if even this much can be held for so long, what else is being carried in the deep? What slow rivers under us are shaping tomorrow's coasts? What gentle hands are moving the continents onward even now, inviting us to lean in and listen to the mantle's quiet breath? We let that question lower us into warmth where light does not travel, into a darkness that is not empty but full of motion so patient it becomes a kind of stillness. Down here, heat rises not as flames but as whispers, released from the slow arithmetic of radioactive decay, left over from the planet's first bright assembling. And those whispers become currents that turn rock into something that behaves like a very thick wind. Not because the Earth is restless, but because balance is never finished. Hot rock wants to rise, cool rock wants to sink, and in that simple wanting a global tide begins, a tide we feel not in water but in stone. We picture it carefully, like tracing a hand over a sleeping back. Broad cells of convection rolling over spans longer than memory, bringing warmth upward in wide plumes, returning cooled slabs downward along shadowed trenches where oceans bow and slip into the dark. Subduction is a slow surrender that feeds renewal, and it is gentler than it sounds when stretched across millions of years. A slab descends, carries water into the mantle's heat, lowers the melting point there, and somewhere above, in a quiet arc, new magma gathers and rises and cools, adding a thin page to the continent's edge. Could it be that the continents travel because they are constantly being courted from beneath, lifted here, tugged there, by this unseen conversation between warmth and weight? Maybe, maybe not. And yet the shapes that echo through seismic maps hint at this dialogue. Cold tongues descending, warm columns climbing, the planet thinking in slow, deliberate spirals. We let our minds float with a plate for a while, feeling ridge push from the long spine of a spreading center where basalt freezes from upwelling melt, feeling slab pull where an older, denser floor tilts down and invites the rest to follow. The motion is measured in centimeters a year, faster than fingernails, slower than plans, and still, given time, the distances become oceans, the separations become mountain belts, the reunions become supercontinents that breathe in and out with the planet's hidden lungs. Each drift is a question, the kind that doesn't need an immediate answer. Is this crust light enough to ride above drag, rigid enough to cross a warm valley without breaking, humble enough to yield at its margins so the whole can keep moving? Not because the continents choose, but because buoyancy and friction negotiate, and their negotiations are signed in coastlines and sutures we can trace long after the pen is gone. We listen for the rhythm that makes and unmakes seas. At ridges, new floor is born in a thin fire. At trenches, old floor returns to source. Between these, plates carry continents like careful ferries, and the ferries change their routes as the engines of heat rearrange themselves deep below. Is it possible that climate, fossils, and forgotten epochs are passengers on these ferries, reshaped not only by air and ice but by the long steering from beneath? When a continent shifts latitude, forests shift with it. Reefs follow warmth until warmth moves on. Deserts collect where rain shadows drift across the map. The rock remembers these migrations in layers and bones and isotopes that hold the accent of the air they breathed, the temperatures they endured, the silences that followed endings. We can read that record and still admit how soft our focus must be when what we study moves slower than our species can stay in one place. We bring our attention to the edges, where the conversation is most audible. At transform faults, plates slide past with the shrug of old neighbors, grinding quietly on the scale we inhabit, noiseless on the scale of deep time. Entropy trims the roughness, but not all at once. At rifts, a continent thins like glass warmed from below, fractures in a patient lattice, and sinks just enough to welcome a narrow sea that will widen into an ocean if the current keeps its promise. At collisional fronts, buoyant crust refuses to go under and folds into mountains whose roots sink deep and whose peaks are offered to frost and rain, which return them as sand to the shelves that will later rise again. Not because the world loves cycles for their poetry, but because cycles are how energy and mass find rest without stopping. It can be tempting to imagine the mantle as chaos, but when we soften our eyes, we see pattern. Superplumes rising under places that will host long volcanic provinces, cool slabs pooling at boundaries inside the earth like clouds banking against a range, the whole interior adjusting in very slow steps toward a balance it can never fully reach. The continents, thick and light, ride these adjustments like calm travelers who trust the road even when it bends through night. If identity for a landmass is its craton's quiet spine, then purpose, if we dare to use that word carefully, may be found in the journey itself, in being carried where the warm rivers will take it, gathering climates and creatures and sediments like stamps on a passport written in stone. We rest with the thought that heat, leaking away grain by grain, is the clock behind all this motion. Decay gives time its direction. The planet cools, convection slows, plates change their pace, and the maps we could draw in a billion years will be different not only in outline but in tempo. Could it be that the calm we feel on a still night is faintly connected to the slowing heartbeat beneath us? That the hush we love is also the world cooling into a deeper quiet? Maybe, maybe not. And still the notion comforts. Even change grows gentle given enough time. The continents will continue their drift, but the thunder below will lengthen its pause between words. A traveler needs a sea, even a warm, dark one, and dust, grown into continents, accepts the passage with grace. Along the way, fossils are carried to high country and set staring at the sky. Isotope trails are tucked into crystals that will outlast the mountains that raise them. Forgotten epochs are folded, unfolded, and filed again in new drawers of sediment. Memory is everywhere, not as a fixed photograph, but as a pattern that reappears. Opening, closing, erasing, revealing. The mantle's rivers provide the current. The plates provide the boats. The shores we know are the wake on the surface of a story we can only partly hear. We are almost ready to ask about the rhythm within the rhythm. The heartbeat that opens oceans and closes them in vast cycles, gathering lands into one breath and letting them go with the next. If the slow thunder below is a voice, it sometimes speaks in pulses we can follow across eras, in sutures that mark old unions and rifts that promise new paths. And yet, if the continents are travelers and the mantle is the sea, what keeps the journey's cadence so steady? What larger pattern invites lands to part and meet again like old friends who never really say goodbye? Maybe the answer is already waiting in the long pulse of openings and closings we will soon feel under our feet. A gentle drum we might learn to count in our sleep. If the continents are travelers and the mantle is the sea, what keeps the journey's cadence so steady? What larger pattern invites lands to part and meet again like old friends who never really say goodbye? We ease into the answer the way a tide eases into a bay, feeling a rhythm that is not loud but persistent, a low thrum in the maps of deep time. The Wilson cycle is not a single story but a breathing, a long inhale when rifts open and oceans widen, a long exhale when margins meet and mountains rise where water once lay. Not because Earth prefers symmetry, but because heat and gravity and the slow arithmetic of spreading and subduction set the tempo, and continents, with their quiet keels, fall into step. We follow the pulse with our eyes closed, hearing it in rift valleys becoming seas, in seas gaining wind and salt and storm, and then, after a very long while, in those seas narrowing as slabs sink and the edges draw nearer, like hands reaching back across a room. We picture a continent starting to thin where the mantle's warmth presses up from below, a lattice of fractures opening with the care of glass warmed, rivers finding the new lines, magma drawing a red seam along the fault. The land pulls apart not because it is angry, but because buoyancy invites it. Hot rock rises, surface spreads, basalt cools into a newborn floor that chalks a straight, black paragraph between shores now committed to drift. An ocean begins as a thought begins, quietly, then with conviction, and wind learns the path across it, and life follows the new light and nutrients that come with the stirring. Could it be that the opening of a basin also opens a chapter for climate and for creatures, that an infant sea changes the script for deserts and forests half a world away? Maybe, maybe not, and yet the record of fossils and sediments shows shifts in rain and migration when coasts move, shows plankton shells thickening into chalk where warm shallows linger, shows aridity following mountains that are not there yet but will be when these plates eventually collide. Time slows further as the ocean matures, wide and blue and self-assured, riding its mid-ocean ridge like a very long spine. Basalt forms and sinks, the floor renewing even as it ages, the weight growing with distance from the ridge until the edges are heavy enough to bow under their own cool density and slide down at trenches. Subduction begins to knit the basin's fate. Here a chain of islands sparks into being, there a continental edge grows a volcanic arc, and all the while the hinge of a future reunion is set in the slow descent of old crust into warm dark. Not because destiny is written, but because mass follows gradients and gradients do what time tells them to do. We imagine the far-off day when these drifting continents, led by slab pull and guided by deep convection, find each other again. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to raise mountains from seabeds and stitch sutures where fish once swam. Where margins meet, the page turns. Buoyant crust refuses to slide down, and so it folds, and so it lifts, and so it thickens until air begins its long, tender work of taking it apart grain by grain. Orogeny is not a single moment. It is a season that lasts tens of millions of years, a lifting into cold where glaciers can learn new alphabets, a setting for rivers to sharpen their voices and carry entire hillsides toward the sea. The scars of this union endure as sutures, zones of mixed rock, of ophiolites thrust up from vanished floors, of metamorphic minerals speaking calm words about pressure and heat that only patience can translate. Is it possible that mountain belts are the healed places where the world remembers its own embrace? That every ridge is also a memory of closure? Every valley a quiet where the echo of two shores finally went still? We say maybe because certainty would be louder than the story requires, and this is a tale for sleep. When a supercontinent gathers, the pulse pauses at the top of its breath. The landmass is broad enough to reshape winds, to reform rain belts, to draw deserts into its interior where rain seldom reaches, to give forests long coastlines and then take them away. Life adapts, wanders, speculates with form. Extinction and opportunity walk together along shores that advance and retreat. Sediments lay down a long cord of red beds across arid hearts and coal across wetter margins, fossil leaves and shells recording the air's chemistry, the ocean's oxygen, the angles of sunlight in rings and pores and tiny isotopic accents. And then, within, heat gathers again beneath the heavy blanket. Plumes rise like slow lanterns. Stress arranges itself along old sutures, and a crack reopens where an ancient seam once healed. Not because history repeats exactly, but because the crust remembers where it was once easy to part, and in remembering, the Wilson cycle exhales. We walk along a coastline in our minds that did not exist yesterday in geologic time and will not exist tomorrow, and listen to the pulse as waves tap it out on stone. Oceans open, oceans close, continents separate, continents reunite. The intervals are not equal, the steps are not simple, but the cadence is there, steady enough that we can speak of earlier rounds, of lands that gathered before our maps and broke before our names, of sutures now hidden in shields where only isotopes and textures betray their presence. The dust remembers in cycles, not because dust thinks, but because erosion and burial, uplift and wear, make archives that repeat their themes even as the words change. In one basin, chalk. In another, shale. In another, sandstone singing of a river that braided across a plain that now sits 1,000 meters high, dry and golden in the late light. We soften our gaze and see that the Wilson cycle is more than a sequence. It is a generous frame that holds smaller rhythms. Volcanic arcs that flicker on and off, rifts that start and fail, microcontinents that take a brief walk alone before tying up to a larger shore. Entropy is present in every step, encouraging the spread of heat, the diffusion of gradients, the smoothing of roughness. And yet order rides along too, in the persistent return of rifts and sutures, in the mountain belts raised along familiar corridors, in the way subduction zones travel like slow stitches around a basin's hem. Could it be that memory at the planetary scale is simply the persistence of pathways, the tendency for stress to find old routes, for buoyancy to favor old habits, for the crust to answer the same quiet questions with similar, though never identical, answers? Maybe, maybe not. And the not is a kindness that keeps wonder awake. We turn to the sediments that hold the pulse like sheet music, and we run a finger along their bars. Varied grains hum in rhythm, coarse when mountains were near and high, fine when seas were deep and still, dark layers when oxygen fled the water, light when currents returned with breath. Fossils keep time, too, appearing, changing, pausing, then returning in new arrangements after the stage resets under a different sky. Isotope trails sketch the climate's phrasing. Oxygen in shells lifting and falling with ice. Carbon shifting with forests that grew broad, then thinned when the air and water changed partners. These notes are not separate from the cycle. They are the melody that rides on its drum, the life that fills the space the plates provide. In the hush between words, we let ourselves feel the gentleness in the vastness. The cycle does not hurry. It keeps its promises on a schedule too wide to hold in a single thought. It is not here to reassure us, and yet, like sleep, it returns, gathering what was scattered, loosening what was bound, offering a place where patterns can rest before changing again. If the Wilson cycle is a heart, then the continents are the breath moving through it, and we are a brief awareness passing through a room that has always been breathing. We do not need to know which coast will open next or which suture will wake beneath snow. We need only to trust that opening and closing are both forms of care in a world that keeps its balance by moving. And yet, if the pulse can leave scars we can read after 500 million years, if mountains can rise from seafloor and return to sand while the rhythm continues unbroken, what else is written into the rafts themselves? What quiet difference lets them float higher, endure longer, gather more stories before the next breath? Perhaps the answer lies in the material of the rafts, in what they are made of and how that makes them buoyant against the dark, warm sea that carries them. Perhaps the next step is to look not at oceans moving, but at what the continents truly are, rafts of granite, seas of basalt, and listen for the softness in that contrast as the night turns one page further. We let the map loosen and slow until it feels like breath itself, and watch as separate shores drift inward, as if the world were drawing a long inhale that would gather distant names into one quiet syllable. Pangea. Not because the planet prefers unity, but because currents in the mantle set a table where plates meet, and in meeting they build belts of stone that remember everything they touch. We see Gondwana first, old and heavy with the calm bones of Cratons. Africa, South America, Antarctica, India, Australia, holding hands across a southern ocean that narrows like a dream that keeps returning to the same room. We imagine the edges where these lands joined, not as seams in cloth, but as mountains rising where coasts once rested their foreheads on salt. Orogenic belts, the sutures lifted into snow and granite, then wore down into stories, then lifted again somewhere else, because the breath that gathers is never a single exhale of stone, but many long sighs of collision. Paleomagnetism turns the planet into a compass that remembers its own heart. Iron in lava cooled under ancient skies points to where the poles once were, and by following those tiny needles frozen in place we set the continents back where they stood when forests were not our forests, when deserts wore different names, when coal began as a wet whisper under fern-dark light. Could it be that rocks carry the choreography of latitude in their cooled arrangement, that we can watch a land cross climates the way a bird crosses seasons? We think softly about fossils like torn pages rejoined, the same leaf imprints pressed into stone on opposite sides of an ocean that did not yet exist when those leaves fell, the same reptile's footprints separated by a later sea, the same river fish whose bones found rest in silt that has since drifted continents apart. Not because coincidence is generous, but because separation came after companionship, and the evidence behaves like old photographs slipped into the wrong albums until someone recognizes the face and places it home. Gondwana's long dream plays on in these fragments. Glossopteris ferns fanning in polar twilight, Mesosaurus tracing shallow lagoons where shorelines had not finished deciding which way to lean. Deserts gather in the heart of Pangea, where rain must wander far from coasts and often loses its way, Red beds stack in the Museum of Time, iron stained by air, a quiet oxidation that hints at atmospheres that breathed differently then. Each layer a muted calendar of drought and occasional flood. Farther toward the margins, coal forests thicken under warm humidity, tree ferns and lycopsids building slow cathedrals of shade, storing sun in cellulose that will, with burial and pressure, become the black script we burn to light our brief rooms. Is it possible that climate itself is an itinerant librarian, shelving deserts and forests across latitudes as the supercontinent drifts beneath its wind, rearranging what grows and what sleeps with a patience we only recognize in hindsight? We follow shorelines with gentle eyes as they press together. Laurentia meeting Baltica, Avalonia threading a needle between, mountain belts rising where oceanic floors gave their last bow into the mantle's dark doorway. Ophiolites, the green-black ghosts of ancient seafloors, are thrust up into daylight and placed like bookmarks at the key moment of closure. Isotope trails and metamorphic minerals tell of pressures that crush and heats that rearrange, of water released from sinking slabs that whispered to overlying rocks, change here, change now, and they did. Maybe memory is the willingness to be altered and still hold the shape of the story within. When we turn the map and watch Pangaea exhale, the breath is not a snap, but a long, kind letting go. Rifts open along lines of weakness, often where old sutures once healed, because stone remembers where it was easy to part and requests mercy when it must part again. Basins tentatively fill with water, first as lakes, then as narrow seas, then as oceans that possess their own weather and voice. The Atlantic does not arrive. It is persuaded into being by time and temperature, by mantle murmurs and crustal patience. Gondwana itself loosens its grip, India slipping away like a dream that chooses another dawn, Africa turning, Australia drifting south and then east, each motion slow enough to be called stillness if you lived less than 1,000 lifetimes. We feel the quiet suffering and the quiet kindness of erosion touching newly risen mountain belts. Rivers hum old songs into new valleys, glaciers test their alphabets on fresh uplifts, and sediments leave layered letters on continental shelves that will one day be read as chronicles of wind and rain. In these archives we hear the pulse of the Wilson cycle underneath, the opening and closing, but here, with Pangaea and Gondwana, we are allowed to hear the harmonies. How forests answer desert, how coal answers red bed, how fossils answer fractures, how paleomagnetism answers a question we had not yet formed. We want to ask what was lost, and we can try gently. Shorelines that had cradled shallow seas went dry beneath mountains. Species that thrived along a united coast found themselves stranded when the breath reversed. Climates shifted slowly enough to invite adaptation and fast enough to ask for grace. Not because the world is cruel, but because it cannot hold still and remain itself. Could it be that the mercy of slow change is that it leaves traces we can follow, so that even in our forgetting we might relearn the way back to diagrams of care hidden in stone? We let the maps move like sleep, drifting continents together and apart in dim light until we feel the tenderness of the gesture more than the mechanics. Hands held across oceans that are not oceans yet. Hands that slip away not in anger but in trust that they will meet again under another sky with another forest reading its script of air. The breath continues, and Gondwana's dream becomes the prologue to another joining and another letting go. And yet, if continents can clasp and part with such enduring grace, if the scars of their embrace lift into mountains that rain will patient down into futures, what does that say about the rafts themselves? About why some float higher, linger longer, and gather more stories than the floors beneath them? Perhaps the answer is already rising at the edge of thought, where granite rides above basalt, and a quiet contrast begins to explain how memory is kept in stone. We slow our gaze and let the difference come forward on its own. Continents as rafts of granite and metamorphic lightness, oceans as sheets of basalt poured from the planet's warm lungs, both born of the same interior breath yet fated to very different journeys. Not because one is nobler, but because chemistry tilts the scales. Silica-rich crust thickens, cools, and floats higher. Iron and magnesium-rich crust spreads thin and grows heavy with age until it bows and slips back into the dark. Could it be that endurance favors the light not through strength, but through buoyancy, a softness that refuses to drown? Maybe, maybe not, and yet the maps of deep time lean toward this quiet truth. Ocean floors come and go like tides of rock. Continents linger like islands of long memory. We picture the boundary between them as a shoreline and as a seam, a shifting margin where basalt meets silt, where granite's patient height receives the river's long handwriting. The oceanic crust is young almost everywhere you look, renewed at ridges, cooled as it travels, seeded with vents where microbes write the first paragraphs of energy from stone rather than sunlight. And then, when its weight becomes a promise it cannot keep, it bends at trenches and descends, carrying water, carbon, and stories into the mantle's low-lit archives. The continental crust is old in a different way. Thickened in erogenes, armored by cratons, altered and re-altered by intrusions and metamorphism until it becomes more archive than canvas, pages rewritten but not erased. Is it possible that identity in matter is less a fixed face and more a layered script? A palimpsest where endurance is the art of being reworded without losing the theme? We walk, unhurried, from a granite ridge into a basalt plain in our imagination and feel the contrast underfoot. Granite's minerals, quartz and feldspar, sparkle with a cool restraint, like ice that remembers fire. Basalt's fine grains hold their dark like evening water, quick-cooled, tight-latticed, ready for work and ready to go. Not because basalt is brief by choice, but because the conveyor it rides is built for return. Subduction is its gentle obligation. To sink, to dehydrate, to lower melting points above, to feed arcs that stitch new light crust onto the continent's edges. Granite is not born from nothing. It is distilled from the mantle's older brew, lifted by water's quiet chemistry and by heat that sorts patiently, then left to cool in chambers that will later stand as pale hills after years of rain. Maybe endurance is not a wall against entropy, but a way of letting entropy become texture. Coarse crystals here, fine veins there, the record of slowness preserved in every face. We listen for fossils, knowing most of them rest on continental shelves, those breathing edges where river loads pause in layered stillness before the next change of level. Here, in limestone and shale and sandstone beds, bones become stories and leaves become signatures, and isotopes settle into shells that remember the temperature of seas now folded into mountains far from shore. The basaltic floors hold their own quiet, but they rarely keep it long. Trenches reclaim them, and their memory is recycled into the common warmth below. Could it be that the world arranged this way so that life would have a table that stays set long enough to gather, evolve, and be read later by anyone willing to listen? Not because purpose demands it, but because buoyancy makes it possible. We consider orogeny as the continent's long schooling. Collision thickens the raft, roots sink deep, metamorphism reworks the grain until rocks become stronger by being changed, and when the mountains lift into frost and cloud, erosion drafts them into story. Rivers turn height to history without spite. Wind and ice carry the rest in slow rehearsals of return. Down basin, those grains stack into bonds that will cement, fracture, uplift, and one day hang in a museum of cliffs under a quiet sky. The oceanic crust participates by leaving, by making room, by returning its material to the mantle's workshop where new recipes are tried. Maybe endurance needs departure as much as constancy, the seafloor's self-erasure feeding the raft's staying power. We keep our thoughts close to the ledger's stone keeps in numbers too patient to shout. Oxygen in carbonates marks pale temperatures. Strontium in rivers sketches the balance between youth of basaltic terrains and the long speech of granitic watersheds. Neodymium and hafnium whisper provenance, tracing sediments back to the hearts that let them go. These are not lists but lullabies we learn to hum. The continents drink from skies that change, breathe out to oceans that remember, and carry in their lightness the ability to stay near the surface long enough to be written upon, again and again, without the page being taken away. Is it possible that memory is simply the privilege of not being recycled too fast? We stand, in thought, at a passive margin where the continent relaxes into a broad shelf and the basaltic plain begins beyond the slope. The shelf thickens with deltas and storms. The plain records the geometry of ridges like a Morse code of birthplaces across the abyss. Somewhere, far along the plate, the future trench waits, gentle with time, unhurried as sleep. The raft does not go there. It stays, it takes on fragments from arcs, it welcomes microcontinents with a patient keel, and when a plume rises, it may thin and sag, but often it heals and continues, because light stone prefers the light. Not because it is immune, but because its best defense is the same as a lily pad's thickness above soft water, a spread that carries weight without surrender. We let ourselves ask the soft questions that never insist on answers. What if endurance is a moral we borrowed from matter, a way of being that keeps shape by floating, by thickening in the right places, by accepting new layers without breaking? What if the ocean floor's willingness to leave is part of the grace that keeps continents able to stay? The planet's exchange of forgetting for remembering in a cycle that carries both with equal care. Maybe, maybe not. And the not reminds us to rest, to read only as much as evening allows. In this dim kindness, dust feels older than dust. The grains that became granite learned a long patience. The lavas that became basalt learned a long return. Between them, a world of memory unfolded. Fossils set into continental pages, isotope trails braided into rivers of evidence, climates shifting across wide rafts that refuse to drown. We do not need to hold the whole mechanism in our hands. We only need to feel the buoyant difference that keeps some stories near the light, while others are folded back into warmth. And yet, if light crust is favored to remain and gather echoes, if these rafts are the places where time lingers and writes, then perhaps the next quiet step is to follow the rivers that write those pages grain by grain, to listen as water turns mountains into sentences and shelves into calm libraries where ancient breath can settle and wait for morning. Here, the first signatures of life enter the ledger with a softness that belies their endurance. A shell pressed into mud, a bone laid gently by a retreating tide, the delicate outline of a fern exhaled onto silt and stilled by sudden quiet. Not because life wished to be remembered, but because entropy sometimes makes room for memory when conditions agree. Rapid burial, an anoxic hush, mineral-laden waters lingering long enough to trade flesh for stone. We are not asked to hurry. We are asked to notice how each layer closes over what it holds, the way a blanket of silt tucks in the curve of a rib, the teeth of a jaw, the thread-like trail of a trilobite crossing an evening of seafloor that no longer exists. Sediment is the handwriting of time. It thickens where rivers give, it thins where currents steal, and in the patient wait of burial, chemistry begins to hum. Pore waters whisper in calcium and silica, iron and carbonate, stitching mineral to mineral until an imprint hardens into testimony. Could it be that fossils are not exceptions, but the quiet outcome of a world that knows how to keep a few things safe while the rest returns to the common dark? Maybe, maybe not, and still the cliffs insist with their measured bars of sandstone and shale, limestone and ash, that life has been speaking to stone for as long as water has carried grains. What if memory is not only in the bones, but also in the spaces between them, in the mud that remembers their shape by refusing to forget? We can linger at a shoreline that no longer meets water, where strata rise like library stacks, every color a different climate, every texture a different pace of wind and rain. Horizontal becomes vertical when plates lift old floors into mountain light. Past oceans become sky-facing archives, and we, brief readers, pass fingers across pages that outlasted their authors. The curve of an ammonite shell tells of buoyancy and balance. The branching of coral heads whispers of warm, clear seas that breathed differently than ours. A forest stamped in coal-black speaks of air rich enough to grow trunks like columns for a temple that now lies underfoot. Not because the world is performing for us, but because the world leaves traces when it has room to rest between motions. Sometimes the ledger darkens all at once, and we are asked to read the pauses as carefully as the words. A layer of iridium-rich dust settles like night across the page. A flood basalt province writes thick syllables of fire. Marine shales grow black where oxygen flees and plankton fall too fast for decay to keep up. Extinction is not a single note but a chord. Volcanic breath, shifting climates, seas rising and receding. A stray stone from the sky, each part different, the outcome the same. A thinning of voices, a brief hush in the chorus. We trace these silences as thin lines through road cuts and canyon walls, and even here the ledger is kind, because the next layer is almost always lighter, a renewal written in shells that return, in leaves that try again, in bones that speak a new grammar of survival. Is it possible that endings are also the way the planet clears a space at the table for what has been waiting its turn? The stone never argues. It only stacks. At the smallest scale, memory settles into numbers that age without impatience. Carbon and oxygen in shells shift with the breath of the climate. Strontium in marine limestones follows the long conversation between granite hills and basalt plains. Sulfur in pyrite records the moods of the sea's invisible workings. Each ratio is a soft lantern in the dark, a way to read temperature and ice, rain and drought, the tilt of axes and the drift of lands. We hold these lanterns carefully, knowing they flicker with local winds, that they tell the truth of a place more than the truth of a planet, and yet together they make a map we can trust enough to walk by. Not because certainty is promised, but because consistency is a kindness that time occasionally grants. There is tenderness in the way decay becomes detail. A bone disappears and leaves a space that fills with quartz, and the animal becomes a cathedral of crystals. A leaf exhales into carbon film, and the tree that once drank light is distilled into a shadow that will not fade. A burrow collapses and is cast, the animal long gone, its hesitation preserved as a tube of stone that still curves where it once decided to turn. Could it be that self-erasure is also a form of memory, that what vanishes makes room for what lasts, and in that exchange meaning is made? Maybe, maybe not. But the ledger keeps offering examples until the idea feels less like a question and more like a place to rest. We imagine a seabed rising in slow motion, an ancient shelf tilting skyward as continents press and the mantle breathes. The fossils climb without moving, lifted into air they could not have known, and weather greets them with a soft brush. An ammonite that slept under a kilometer of silt meets sunlight after 100 million years, and for a moment we stand together at the same edge of the same day. We are small in this company, and it is a comfort. Our history is brief, but our attention can be long, and in the gentle light of notice, even a broken shell can feel like a complete sentence. Dust contains both endings and beginnings, quietly. What settled from the air becomes the first layer of a future page. What eroded from a mountain becomes the ink of a new paragraph. What died becomes a suggestion for life to try some other shape. The ledger has no cover and no final chapter. It is a river turned upright, flowing in place, inviting anyone who can slow down enough to see the current as stacked motion. And yet, if rivers can write mountains into memory and fossils can carry the taste of a vanished sky, what else might the continents be keeping at their calm edges, on shelves where waves breathe in and out, where the planet's long sentences pause and gather, waiting for the next quiet turn of the page? We follow that page as it lifts and falls, slow as sleep, into the long pendulum of climate, a rhythm that prefers patience over spectacle, a drum whose sound is felt more than heard. Ice comes forward not as an army but as a season that learns endurance. It thickens from snow that forgets how to melt, it flows like stone that has remembered how to move, and it presses its cool hand into valleys until the rock answers with the shape of a U. Not because the world grows harsh, but because balance chooses a different center for a while. Sunlight shifts its angles, oceans trade heat with the wind, and dust crosses skies that are saving their warmth for later. We stand with that change and let it be a teacher. Coastlines step outward when water stoops to ice, then step inward again when the lesson is over, and between those footsteps the land wears a necklace of moraines, cames, and drumlins, each beat a syllable in the language of slow cold. We listen for the quiet counters the planet keeps, the small measures that become years and the years that become stories. Oxygen in shells tilts its ratio toward heavier or lighter forms when the sea cools or warms. Carbon in stalagmites breathes the mood of the forest above. Dust locked in ice carries the accent of deserts that woke when grasses slept, of winds that found new corridors between mountains under a leaner sun. Could it be that memory, for climate, is a set of soft numbers arranged like lullabies? Never loud, never insistent, but true enough to guide us through the dim? Maybe not, and still, when we slice a core from a Greenland night or an Antarctic morning and see layers stacking like rings of snow-white glass, we feel time agree to be counted. Each line a winter's whisper, each pocket of old air a sigh kept safe, telling us how much breath the world held and how gently it let that breath go. Ice is a maker of clarity, a sculptor that reveals the bones of the land by lifting its softer disguises and arranging them neatly at the margins. Valleys deepen and then carry their melt as rivers that glitter like patient stitches across the skin of a newly woken plain. Where glaciers lingered, lakes string themselves along like mirrors set in a careful row. Where they paused, ridges of stone remember the rest. Not because ice wants anything, but because weight and slope and time, given room, compose their own kind of art. And when the pendulum swings the other way, when warmth lays its hand upon the map, forests return as green handwriting on slopes once scraped to their syllables. Peat grows in saucers left by the departing cold, and coastlines readjust their sentences to a new line length. The continents breathe, and the exhale is different from the inhale, and both are sincere. In the sea, the rhythm writes itself into deep mud that looks like quiet but is actually a choir. Foraminifera, the tiny architects of chalk and song, build their shells with the water's isotopic mood, and when they fall, they become notes in layered staff lines that stretch for kilometers beneath the waves. Currents carry heat from the equator toward the poles and return with a tempered humility, overturning in places where cold and salt make water heavy enough to sink. Is it possible that the continents, by standing where they do, help arrange these currents, steering winds with mountains, shaping basins that decide where the ocean flips from surface to deep? Maybe, maybe not, and yet the correspondence is tender. A narrow strait opens and a current learns a new word. A land bridge closes and a migration pauses. Glaciers advance, and the ocean's chemistry rewrites a few of its quieter chapters in response. Entropy does not sleep in any of this. It is the background hum, encouraging gradients to soften and differences to fade. But the pendulum keeps contrast alive just long enough for memory to take root. When cold holds court, ice carves and carries. When warmth returns, soil forms quickly on raw stone, microbes and moss rehearsing the first lines of a forest's future. A hillside scraped clean becomes a classroom where plants relearn how to grip, where nitrogen is coaxed back into circulation by quiet workers no larger than flakes of dust. The story is not of victory but of continuity, a promise that processes will keep speaking to one another until a landscape remembers its own name again. What if identity, for a place, is not a single picture but a habit of recovering, of returning to a recognizable arrangement after a long soft change? We let our attention settle on coastlines, where the pendulum writes most visibly. When ice grows, continental shelves are walked upon by sunlight and storm. River mouths extend into raw, bright air, drawing deltas like slow hands into the former sea. When ice retreats, those shelves drown with grace, and drowned valleys become estuaries where salt and fresh water learn to share. Marshes braid themselves across the boundary, trapping silt, sheltering breath, turning carbon into stillness that will be saved in mud for a time longer than the lives of trees. Could it be that the planet's gentlest archives are these quiet margins, places that accept the rhythm and, in accepting, make the rhythm legible? Maybe, maybe not. But the map of submerged rivers and raised beaches, of coral terraces and stranded lines of shells, reads like sheet music that the tides never forget. We remember, too, that the pendulum's longer swings have brushed the whole planet, greenhouse warmth when crocodiles sunned near polar forests, snowball Earth episodes when ice reached low latitudes and the ocean breathed in a hush. These are not bedtime stories so much as bedside lamps turning up and down, and across them life has practiced patience, innovation, retreat, and return. Fossils share this lesson without complaint. Leaves thickening their cuticles in dusty air. Shells changing the geometry of their spirals to manage the chemistry of a troubled sea. Pollen appearing in bands that tell where forests moved as climate asked them to seek kinder ground. The persistence is not loud, and that is why it comforts. Life learns, loses, learns again, and the land keeps the notebook open. Under our feet, plates continue their measured glide, subduction carrying old ocean floors downward, arcs adding new stone to continental edges, and climate listens to this tectonic language even as it sets its own meter. Volcanoes breathe CO2 from the deep. Weathering on rising mountains draws it back into the quiet of carbonates. The pendulum receives these gestures and adjusts. Silence is part of the exchange. Long periods where nothing dramatic happens, only the steady negotiation between rock and rain, between leaf and light, between wind and water's skin. What if the most faithful part of the world is the quiet between events, the stillness that lets patterns become themselves? We hold the rhythm a moment longer, like the last note of a lullaby. The continents have been shaped by ice's careful hand and water's returning brush. Their soils thickened and thinned, their rivers rethreaded, their coastlines redrawn as if the world were tidying its desk and then spreading the papers out again. We do not argue with the pendulum. We let it pass through us the way sleep passes, trusting that breath knows what to do. And yet, if climate can carve and refill, pause and proceed, what happens when the pause itself is lifted into mountains, when seabeds are raised into air, and the ledger of old weather is opened upright to the sun? Maybe the next step is to walk into that lifted world and read the fossils face to face, where past oceans have become skylit pages turning slowly in the wind. We turn the page gently, and the light changes. The air feels thinner here, as if the world has just exhaled after holding something difficult for a very long time. Extinction does not arrive like a shout so much as a soft, continuous dimming. A hush that spreads across forests and shelves and shoals until the chorus thins and the soloists go quiet, and then even the echoes fold into themselves. Not because life is fragile in a simple way, but because everything alive answers to balances that can tip when the sky breathes different, when the sea turns its chemistry by a small degree, when the land moves just enough to change the wind's mind. Could it be that endings are a kind of map, a redraw of coastlines that no cartographer would choose, but which the world insists on to make room for another script? We lean over the rim of erased worlds and try to hear what changed the key. Sometimes it is the slow, implacable breath of volcanic traps, basalt stacked like pages of night, exhaling into the sky until the sky must adjust, and while it adjusts, plants and reefs and insects feel the arithmetic shift in their sap and shells. Sometimes it is a stone from space, an abrupt punctuation that lifts dust to the light and lets darkness fall back. The climate stirred and cooled, the food webs unthreading in silence we cannot fathom from our brief rooms. Sometimes it is oceans rearranging their currents, subduction opening or closing deep doors of heat and salt, continents drifting through latitudes where they had no practice, deserts standing where rain once lingered. Maybe not. And yet, when we walk the boundary beds where fossils blink out, the thin dark line is a kind of quiet that needs no emphasis. After the hush, the continents do not hurry. They never do. They hold their calm like a lake at evening, and on that calm the first survivors test small lanterns of form. A fern repeats itself where trees fell. A shell thickens its spiral just enough to fit a colder morning. A mammal tries night and finds night kind. A coral learns a different symbiosis and hangs a new color in the shallows. Extinction as cartographer, drawing new borders between what can live where, pressing forests back to the edges, asking reefs to shift their cities down the slope, inviting deserts to claim an inland plain and turn it to sand song. Not because change is a plan, but because change is how the world keeps breathing when the breath catches. We kneel at a cliff where the story turns, fingers dusty with the ink of an old sea, and we notice that even the dark layer is not the end but a hinge. Above it the grains grow different. The shells take up new ratios. The pollen learns to write under a revised sky. Is it possible that loss teaches the land its next language, and the land speaks that language back to life as paths where roots can hold and currents can feed and eyes can learn to open in a light they have never seen? We think of deserts arriving not as emptiness, but as a new grammar of wind and thorn and cunning shade. We think of forests finding wet corridors north and south, uphill and down, subtle green rivers through the map's relief. We think of reefs trailing their limestone sentences along the shelf as if sound could be laid into stone and then inhabited. Entropy has its say in all of this. It takes apart what was built with a careful grace that is easy to mistake for indifference. But decay, in its patient tempo, becomes the preparation for different growth. Dead forests feed dark soils where seedlings try. Collapsed reefs form rubble slopes where larvae find a foothold out of the reach of storms. Ash falls into lakes and makes their quiet waters very rich for a season that lasts a few thousand years. What if memory is the capacity to be remade without forgetting the whole, and extinction is a rough-handed, sorrow-soft lesson in that capacity? Maybe not. And the not is an open window the night is happy to pass its breeze through. We look up and realize the continents themselves were always listening. Plates tilt and pull as heat beneath them rearranges its slow intent. Mountains rise along sutures where once two coasts touched. Shelves drown and reappear with the pendulum of ice. And in these movements, unhurried and enormous, The stage keeps offering new corners of shadow and light. Volcanic arcs bead like dim lamps along a trench, their ashes seeding soil far inland. A terrain docks onto a craton's edge and brings its fossils like a trunk of old clothes to a new home. The land is a keeper of rooms, and extinctions are the quiet reshuffling of furniture after a long winter. We step into one of those rooms in our minds, a basin turned meadow turned lake turned plain, and watch a species we do not have names for test the margins. A dragonfly wears a color that makes the morning seem deeper. A fern lifts its architecture one frond higher. A small jaw learns to chew a different root in a different light. The ledger records these additions not with applause but with layers and ratios, with isotopes bending to the temperature of a day, with carbon marking the breadth of a forest that spread and then thinned. Could it be that the continents keep endurance not by holding a single cast, but by allowing the cast to change while the stage remains steady, the boards repaired after every storm? We sit with that thought because it is kind. The continents keep their calm, but their stories shift, and the shift is how the calm survives. Extinction redraws. Life redraws back. The borders wander like shorelines at low tide, and somewhere between high and low there is a band of sand that remembers both. A place where new shells begin and old shells break back to dust. Dust, again, the common denominator that never feels common, the final word and the first syllable of every next sentence. And yet, if endings can move edges and edges can invite beginnings, if the map can breathe and still be itself, what happens at the continent's quiet margins where breath is most visible? On those broad shelves where rivers exhale their load, where the sea leans in to read, and where the next soft chapter lays itself down grain by unhurried grain. We listen closer, not to the cliffs this time, but to the numbers curled within their crystals, the delicate weights of atoms that change so slowly they become a kind of patience. Isotopes are the planet's handwriting, a script without letters, a rhythm written in ratios and half-lives that does not fade when the page is folded, heated, or soaked. Not because matter wants to speak, but because decay proceeds with a steadiness that time respects. Uranium leaning, interval by interval, toward lead inside a zircon that keeps the count. Strontium drifting through rivers as weathering chooses what to carry from granite hills and basalt plains. Neodymium in the crust telling which pieces are old voices and which are new harmonies added from the mantle below. We lean in like listeners outside a quiet room and realize the door is already ajar. There is a tenderness in how these small differences hold the shape of large histories. Lead inside zircon is an archivist who never sleeps, sealing a memory of when the crystal cooled enough to keep the clock honest and then letting the hours fall like soft rain into a pool that only deep time can measure. The crystal is not immune to heat, but it is selective. Close it enough and the record stays. Warm it enough and the record partially resets. Press it just so and it adds a margin note rather than losing the text. Could it be that identity persists in rock as in us, through selective forgetting, by keeping the core and letting the edges be rewritten when they must? Maybe, maybe not, and still, when we read concordant ages from grains carried by a river that only yesterday touched a mountain, we feel how gently the past rides forward, how a continent can hand a 4-billion-year-old spark into a present day without raising its voice. Strontium in rivers is a landscape's accent, where weathering lingers on granites and gneisses, where old hills crumble with dignified slowness, the waters carry a heavier tune. Where young basalts widen their fresh, dark shoulders, the waters lighten their syllables. The ocean hears these accents in every tributary and, over long seasons of the planet's breathing, weaves them into a global tone that rises and falls with mountain building, rifting, and the patient tug of subduction returning floors to warmth. We taste that tone in carbonate shells layered into seafloors later lifted into air. We hear it in stalagmites counting drips in unlit rooms while the forest considers its next move above. Is it possible that the world reveals its changes most kindly in what seems like background, trace elements in a stream, a fractional shift in a shell, so that the story can be read without waking the room? Neodymium is a cartographer of inheritance, a quiet marker of where a rock's substance came from and how long it has walked the surface. Old crust grows distinct from its source with each cycle of melting and cooling. New crust carries more of the mantle's early flavor, a brighter note in the mineral choir. When a continent stitches fragments together, an arc here, a terrain there. These signatures mingle but do not vanish. like dialects woven into a single language that still contains its valleys and coasts. We follow those tones across shields and belts and shelves, noticing where the keel is oldest, where youthful additions rephrased an edge, where a river's sand whispers of a far-off craton unseen from the present shore. Not because we need certainty to rest, but because the willingness to listen is itself a kind of sleep. Isotope trails are not separate from fossils, mountains, or seas. They are those things told softly. Oxygen in shells leans heavier when the world is colder, lighter when warmth returns. Carbon in leaves and limestones bends toward stories of forests thriving or thinning. Sulfur in pyrite speaks in shades of an ocean's breath. Together, they do not shout a plot. They hum a harmony that lets us place scenes on a calendar measured not in days but in graceful powers of 10. Could it be that the planet's identity is not a fixed portrait but a continuity of tone? A set of ratios that keep their music even when the stage is rest-aged and the cast is remade? Maybe, maybe not. And the nod is welcome because it leaves room for wonder to sit beside evidence the way moonlight sits beside a sleeping field. Sometimes the handwriting is corrected by heat and pressure, sometimes smudged by fluids that pass through fractures like a pen lifted and set down again. And in these edits we see the mercy of geology. Metamorphism does not always erase. It often clarifies, realigning minerals, tightening lattices, folding new margins into an older page that can still be read with care. A terrain docks and brings its ledger. A plume rises and adds a hot annotation. A subducting plate releases water that prompts a small note in lighter magmas climbing through a crust that will remember the visit by a change in isotopic tone. The page is busy, and yet it is calm. We step back without stepping away, the way one does from a painting only fully visible at a certain distance. The map of signatures spreads across the continents like morning haze. Zircon ages twinkling in river sands, strontium ratios tracing drainage basins to their stone elders, neodymium charting who arrived when and how long they stayed. Entropy is present, as always, slowly blending extremes, but the planet's handwriting persists because the pen is steady and unhurried. Half-lives keep the beat, and the beat keeps meaning from dissolving into noise. What if memory, at every scale, is just this, a tempo that the world refuses to abandon? And as we let the numbers dim to a kindly background, the land comes forward again. The same hills, the same shelves, the same quiet drift, now carrying a new intimacy, as if the ground had let us overhear a private conversation and trusted us to keep the tone. Dust answers in ratios and half-lives not to be clever, but to be consistent, and that consistency is what makes the drift of continents feel less like motion and more like breath. We do not need to solve the script tonight. It is enough to know the ink is still drying in places and still legible in others, enough to sense that identity persists because the world writes often and gently. And yet, if signatures can survive melting and pressure, if a river can carry a billion-year voice into a daylit delta, what new lines are being written right now along the edges where plates meet and part, at the trenches where old floors surrender, at the arcs where light magmas rise, at the quiet gates where descent becomes renewal? Perhaps the next soft turn is to follow one such gate, down where the ocean bows into warmth and the planet edits itself with care, inviting new pages to form for continents that have not yet learned their names. We lower our attention to the trenches where light cannot travel, where the seafloor leans forward as if whispering a promise and then keeps it, inch by inch, century by century. Subduction begins quietly, not because it is small, but because scale itself is a lullaby. Old basalt grows dense and cool and bows beneath the edge of a lighter raft, and in that bow it carries with it a memory of ocean. Water held in minerals, water trapped in pores, water that will become a key when it meets the mantle's warm patience. Could it be that the world renews itself not with fire alone, but with water teaching stone to melt at kinder temperatures, coaxing new magmas to rise where they will later speak as islands, arcs, and the first lines of a future shore? Maybe, maybe not. And still the chemistry hums the same tune each time we listen. As the slab descends, pressure grows like a steady hand, and the heat that once seemed far away becomes the room itself. Minerals change their minds without leaving, exchanging atoms like courteous dancers. At certain depths, water is released into the surrounding mantle, and the solid rock there, so close to melting, accepts the invitation and yields to a partial glow. Melt gathers, light with silica, buoyant as a thought that refuses to stay down, and begins to rise through fractures and old weaknesses, pausing in chambers where it cools enough to organize its crystals, or continuing on to spill into air as arcs bead along the trench like a chain of low lanterns. Not because the planet wants islands, but because balance offers them when conditions agree, and those islands will someday collide with a continent's edge and stitch themselves along its seam, a quiet hem in the fabric of land. We picture this rising not as a fountain but as a slow tide passing through stone, and we feel how renewal is a long, low hum. Magma added here, altered there, resting to become granite beneath a mountain to be, or spilling as andesite that weathers into soils that hold forests with generous hands. In time, arcs dock. Microcontinents tie their ropes to larger hulls. Pressure thickens crust until mountains kneel into the sky. Roots plunge deep, dense and strong, storing potential like coiled time, while the peaks offer themselves to frost and rain, which accept with gratitude and carry grains toward deltas where the next quiet chapter settles. Is it possible that the way continents grow is less an act of conquest and more a practice of layering, accepting what rises, letting go of what is too heavy, and trusting water to write the transitions with a careful pen? If we listen closely, the trench itself is a threshold with two directions of memory. Downward, the slab bears old ocean stories, sediments, fossils, isotope accents in clay and carbonate, into darkness where they are remixed, their specifics given back to heat so that general truths can rise again as new stone. Upward, the arcs and their hinterlands record pressures and temperatures in minerals that keep their cool handwriting even after metamorphism. Amphiboles, micas, garnets. Each is a small diary of the path taken, each a witness that the gate exists and keeps its promises. Not because rock intends to testify, but because structure preserves, and preservation is the planet's way of telling itself what it has done. There is kindness in the timing. Plates advance at a pace that does not startle sleep. Centimeters a year, a thread pulled through a quilt so slowly the pattern seems still. Yet over deep time the stitches become visible. A peninsula that wasn't, a plateau that rose from seafloor, a range that gathered snowfall into new rivers whose names no one will learn for 1,000,000 years. Entropy attends to all of it, smoothing differences, blending extremes, encouraging heat to spread and mountains to slump. And yet the gate keeps the engine running, maintaining gradients, inviting contrasts to return so that valleys and coasts can form again, where life will try its next arrangements. What if persistence, for a planet, is simply this? A door that never slams, always opens, always receives, always releases. We drift along an imaginary cross-section and notice small mercies in hard places. The slab, though sinking, is not erased all at once. It travels far, sometimes to boundaries within the mantle where cold collects like clouds pooling against a quiet range. Echoes from earthquakes map its descent in faint sketches. Tomography paints it as a fading ribbon, proof that even in surrender there is shape. Above, the ark's magmas differentiate. Iron settling, silica enriching, until some bodies are dark and quick, others pale and slow, the latter cooling into granites that will later stand as soft-colored hills when everything darker has worn away. Could it be that endurance itself is distilled in these chambers, that the lightest parts of a melt become the longest-lasting pages of the crust? Where arcs collide with continents, where trenches migrate, where slabs tear and reattach, the map's edge becomes an improvisation that still follows rules. Fluids alter peridotite into new minerals. Serpentinites carry water deeper than it seemed possible to carry. Blueschist belts rise to daylight bearing the hue of pressures just shy of metamorphic fire. These are the souvenirs of passage, the postcards the gate sends up to say it is working. We turn them in our hands and think of all that could not be carried. Seafloor basalt swallowed, ancient ooze turned anonymous. But even anonymity is not waste. It is the warm reserve from which tomorrow's arcs and plateaus will be drawn. And then, after the collision, after the thickening, after the origin's long, slow crescendo, the quiet returns. Mountains lean into weather's soft request. Rivers lift the stored altitude and spread it thin across plains. Deltas grow fat with borrowed height. The roots, having done their work, may delaminate and sink like a thought released, lightening the crust above so it rises gently. A second wind in rock. Renewal comes in many tempos. The suddenness of a lava dome at dawn. The centuries of soil forming on ash. the million-year blink of a foreland basin filling with the syllables of a future desert. Not because time is generous or cruel, but because time is thorough. We rest with the cadence until it becomes a breath we can share. Subduction is a bow, melting is a whisper, arcs are the answer, collisions the embrace, erosion the good night that promises morning. The continents learn this rhythm not as students memorizing lines, but as bodies feeling a pulse and moving with it, adjusting balance with each step, carrying life along in carriages of soil and stone that seldom tip even when the road leans. Maybe, maybe not, and still the comfort holds. The gate remains, the engine hums, and the map keeps its quiet motion. And yet, if renewal is composed of echoes rising through stone, if trenches write invitations and arcs reply with light, what other messages travel the deep hall where lightless waves pass? What quiet shapes beneath our feet guide these journeys without ever reaching the surface? Perhaps the next gentle question is to follow the echoes themselves, to listen as earthquakes trace silhouettes of sinking slabs and rising plumes, and to feel how the darkness below sketches the continents above with a patient, invisible hand. And yet, if renewal is composed of echoes rising through stone, if trenches write invitations and arcs reply with light, what quiet shapes beneath our feet guide these journeys without ever reaching the surface? We follow that softness upward until the heat loosens, until rock meets rain, until the planet's loudest stories thin into a breath at the surface where the smallest workers wait. This is where the quiet alchemy begins, not because it is simple but because it is kind. Granite loosens grain by grain, feldspar surrendering to clay as water learns the seams and lingers. Basalt opens to acids in the rain, its iron and magnesium becoming food for a darker green. The air gives a little carbon to the waters that trickle through cracks, and the trickle answers by pulling ions from the stone and making new minerals that hold moisture like a promise. Could it be that the most powerful transformation is not the molten birth of continents, but the patient weathering that turns them into a thin, living film, a skin that remembers every season as texture and scent? We lean close to this film and see that nothing here is idle. Microbes map themselves onto mineral faces and begin to whisper with enzymes, unlocking what is held too tightly, stitching carbon to nitrogen to phosphorus in arrangements that life can reach. Fungi run their threads through soil like soft lightning, trading sugars for elements found in grains too small to name, teaching roots the hidden paths between pebbles where water rests and where it will return. Not because intention directs it, but because chemistry and contact, given time, behave like care. In this dark, cool room beneath the grass, a leaf that fell last autumn gently releases its shape to 1,000 mouths. A beetle shell becomes a handful of angles on a clay plate. A fallen feather becomes a line the rain can read. Maybe identity here is the opposite of hardness. A willingness to be changed into something useful by a neighbor who needs what you no longer require. We listen to the ions move, slow as breath in sleep, carrying answers along capillaries between grains. Hydrogen loosens, hydroxide tags along, bicarbonate leaves with pieces of rock folded into its calm. Calcium finds its way to a root's request and is thanked with a measure of sugar. Iron oxidizes and colors horizons a faint, familiar red that remembers days of air and water and sun. Is it possible that soil is a memory given back to life as resource? A ledger that records not only what was but what can be. Carbon takes the hint and stays a while, choosing to rest in humus that darkens the topmost inches like dusk, the molecules layered and curled to fit one another, resisting the hurry of decay just enough to give the next generation a softer bed. When rain returns, it does not forget where it has been. Drops land and become threads, and threads gather into rivulets that slip through pore spaces shaped by worms and roots and forgotten burrows now made into tunnels of kindness. Along these paths, traces of nutrients travel from broken feldspar to sprouting seed, from decomposed leaf to a stem that will hold light again in a few weeks. Soil forms as a conversation between what falls from above and what rises from below, and the conversation is fluent in patience. Entropy is here, always, unspooling complexity into simpler parts, but in the company of clay and microbes and time, that simplification becomes scaffold rather than ending, the step that lets larger shapes grow without strain. We kneel and notice horizons stacking in colors that read like a quiet story. Dark where life rests, paler where leached minerals pass. rusty where iron decides its form, gritty where parent rock still holds its vowels. In places where basalt weathered, the earth is thick with gifts, the cations abundant, the harvests generous. In places where quartz speaks loudest, the soil is patient and light, asking roots to travel farther and communities to collaborate. Not because one stone is kinder than another, but because soils inherit their tendencies and then learn from the climate laid upon them. Winds deliver dust from far deserts to feed fields that sit under gentle rains. Rivers flood and leave silt that makes a page better able to hold ink. Glaciers grind and retire, and their leaving gives a gravelly openness that teaches pine to be lean and spruce to be careful. We consider the long arithmetic that joins sky to ground. Carbon leaves the air and lingers as a season of sugar, then a year of litter, then a decade of humus, then a century folded into clays, then a millennium in deep horizons where oxygen arrives slowly and decisions take their time. In this laying by, climate writes a subtle signature. Cool soils breathe more slowly, warm soils speak more quickly. Wet and dry mark their cadence in the way aggregates hold or fall apart. Could it be that soil is the planet's softest instrument, tuning the air by how it keeps and releases breath? Maybe, maybe not, and either way the melody is gentle. Forests lean greener when the ground is fed. Rivers run clearer when the surface is held. The air tastes kinder when the dark layer is allowed to grow. We keep our eyes on decay because decay here is devotion. A fallen branch does not disappear. It becomes corridors for ants and sponges for rain, scaffolds for fungi, bridges for salamanders, then a lacework of lignin that finally gives up and becomes a brown that holds 1,000 voices at once. Bones return calcium to a seedling. Shells give their carbonate to a hillside. Even the ash from fire becomes a brief brightness that certain plants have been waiting for. A key the soil recognizes as a cue for renewal. Not because endings are easy, but because endings are thorough, and in their thoroughness they make room. From cosmic ash to harvest, the circle closes softly. The dust that once gathered to form a world now gathers again, smaller, kinder, closer to breath and root and wing, and the continents wear this film like a memory and a promise. We stand at the edge of a field at dusk, a field that was forest, that was floodplain, that was sea, and feel how every grain underfoot has been many things and will be many more, and in that journey the thin layer stays itself by helping other things become themselves. We do not need to finish the thought, we need only to rest in its cadence. And yet, if such quiet alchemy can turn stone into cradle, if the smallest workers can hold the air and feed the rivers and knit the slopes against the pull of rain, what other messages are traveling beneath us in the dark? What echoes in the mantle, what silhouettes of slabs and plumes are sketching the continents from below, asking us to listen as the earth writes its shapes with sound we cannot hear but can almost feel? We lift that question gently into the present and find our hands full of small, persistent things. Bits of plastic that catch light like brittle shells, threads of polyester glinting like modern hair under a microscope, grains of cement dust that settle into puddles and seize into thin stone. Not because we meant to enter the ledger this way, but because all making leaves residue, and residue finds its level, and the level becomes a layer that will one day be read like an accent we never knew we had. Could it be that dust is learning a new word tonight, and the word, softly, is us? We imagine the slow rain of our artifacts falling into lakes, onto shelves, through estuaries where salt and fresh water negotiate their truce. A bottle cap sinks and waits. The bottle itself sails a season, frays into chips, then into fibers so slight that plankton mistake them for dinner and fold them into their chalky phrases. The chalk will fall, and the fibers will fall with it, and together they will write a margin note in the fine gray ooze that coats the deep. Maybe, maybe not, but the pattern is patient. Every wave that breaks is a comb, every shore a sieve, and what cannot be sifted is saved. We do not have to insist on permanence to admit that some plastics will be stubborn, that some alloys will corrode into bright maps inside stones, that concrete will set along forgotten avenues and quarries and remain as fossilized pavements beneath the weeds of a century we cannot see. There are brighter lines, too, sharper syllables we would rather whisper than say aloud. Soot settles like extra night into snowfields that keep careful records. Ash from our fires drifts into peat that will hold its color longer than any name for a season. Radionuclides we released in brief flashes have half-lives that will carry their quiet counting through ages of sediment. a thin flash of arithmetic in a wall of muted clay. Is it possible that one day a cliff will show a narrow band where the atoms hum a different tune, and that band will be us, a moment so small it is almost a blink, and yet bright enough to be legible across the room of deep time? Not because we deserve to be remembered, but because physics is exact and stone is forgiving, and together they keep what lands in their arms. We watch a city crumble in slow motion, which is to say, we watch it as the earth would. A viaduct loses its edges to ice and thaw. Rebar blooms into red seams where water lingers. Asphalt fractures into polygons that mimic dried mud on a tidal flat. The wind carries powdered glass to the lee of a curb where moss will take hold. Bricks find their way into riverbeds where they become smooth as any cobble. A buried metro line turns into a tunnel of sediment, a future trace for some wandering current that prefers waking in darkness. Not because ruin is inevitable, but because nothing stands outside of weather. Even our best intentions, poured by the cubic yard and polished to a mirror, will soften, spall, and descend. They will find company among shells and seeds, gnats and granites, and there they will be edited by the same careful redactors that made the first libraries of cliff and cave. We listen for what we might be giving beyond the solid, and we hear whispers in the chemistry. Nitrogen and phosphorus run from our fields like eager students, turning bays into bloom and quiet into green. Heavy metals ride on dust and settle onto the pages of wetlands that have been keeping time since the ice last folded its maps. Carbon shifts in the air and slides, season by season, into tree rings and corals, adding a widened line, a fainter color, a small change in density that says the world bent slightly, briefly, under new breath. Could it be that the truest technofossils are not objects at all but patterns, altered ratios, reframed cycles, a new cadence in the ocean's overturning, signatures that linger when the plastic has cracked and the concrete has become sand? We keep our voice soft because the thought is large. Somewhere a landfill becomes a hill, and the hill becomes a seam of layered packaging and fruit pits and wire that will, in time, be indistinguishable from a peculiar conglomerate, polymer pebbles, aluminum nodules, glassy clasts welded by calcium and time. Somewhere a wind farm's foundations set like careful punctuation in the shelf, and long after the towers are gone the punctuation remains, a dotted stanza in a shallow sea. Somewhere a storm lays cars into a silted lot and the silt becomes a quiet cement. And in 1,000 years the parking stripes are a faint barcode in a block of stone that remembers the way we organized our days. Not because the earth intends to exhibit us, but because it cannot help absorbing what touches it, and once absorbed, cannot help writing. We are allowed to wonder gently if any of this is kindness. The answer is not ode. The ledger is patient. Dust will learn our word and then use it sparingly the way it used fern and ammonite and tektite and soot before us. Some entries will be loud. A narrow spike of isotopes, a sudden pause in pollen, a coal of blackened microfibers caught in ice, and some will be so quiet that only a curious future hand will find them. Maybe there will be readers. Maybe there will only be weather. Either way, the page will accept what we leave and place it among the older notes without judgment, because judgment is for voices and stone is for keeping. And yet, if the continents can carry us without commentary, if our small, bright moment can settle into the calm sentence of the crust, what else might the stone remember beyond our artifacts? The long, secret pulses beneath cities and forests alike, the echoes that shape us while we are busy shaping the surface? Perhaps the next gentle turn is to lean into that echo, to listen as seismic waves trace shadows of what moves below, and to feel how the planet's deep rooms sketch their stories upward until the ground itself becomes a soft translation of the dark. And yet, if the continents can carry us without commentary, if our small, bright moment can settle into the calm sentence of the crust, what else might the stone remember beyond our artifacts? The long, secret pulses beneath cities and forests alike, the echoes that shape us while we are busy shaping the surface? We follow that echo to the edge of land where the map is never finished, to coasts that arrive and depart like slow thoughts, to shorelines that drift with the breath of the sea as if the world were tidying and untidying itself in patient intervals. Sea levels rise and fall, and with them deltas step forward and then step back. Ports take one last look at the sky and slip under. Stories settle into silt that keeps them without ceremony. Not because the ocean is unkind, but because weight and temperature and the tilt of ice and wind all agree from time to move the line. Could it be that a coastline is less a border than a mood, an edge the planet redraws in a handwriting that prefers curves to rules? We imagine lost harbors turned to quiet reefs of brick and beam, streets softened into sandbars that only gulls and the occasional shadow of a fish know in passing. Wood becomes dark lace under layers of mud. Iron transforms into orange ghosts that taste of salt and patience. Mosaics wash to a blur, and then into clay that remembers color more than shape. Maybe not. And still the rhythm holds. Storm by storm, grain by grain, the map rearranges its furniture, and what was downtown becomes seabed, and what was seabed becomes an underwater terrace draped with eelgrass that threads itself through doorways no one opens anymore. We do not accuse the tide. We listen to its arithmetic and find that subtraction is sometimes only a long addition written in reverse. There are places where the sea steps back instead, and there the cities return in outline when a river cuts a new channel and the bank shears away like paper. A coin blinks in sunlight for the first time in 1,000 tides. The edge of a column shows itself to a heron that is not interested. A wall, still mortared to precision, greets a morning that forgot its name centuries ago. Not because memory insists, but because erosion is generous with what it uncovers when the balance shifts. Is it possible that the continent stores these quiet rooms the way we store old letters in boxes, stacked where they cannot be read quickly, but ready for the day a hand lifts the lid with care? On the shelves just offshore, the archives are deeper and wider. Here, the slow snow of shells and dust thickens year by year, taking in the unremarkable miracles of everyday life. Fish scales, pollen, soot, a fray of rope, a bead of plastic, and lays them down as lines that will one day stand upright and face the weather as cliffs. Ports drown, but their outlines are braided with oysters. Roads collapse into bedding plains that will become guidebooks for future rivers. A lighthouse tilts and finds a second career as a reef. The sea edits without malice. Sediment is a soft sentence that forgives misspellings and keeps the gist. We walk the boundary with a gentle lamp and ask where the old mouths of rivers went when the ice returned, when shorelines marched outward into borrowed sunlight and ships followed them until the sandbars refused. Fossils keep the answers. Tree trunks rooted where waves now speak, mammoth bones salt-streaked in low-tide shallows, peat that formed in a forest floor now rising in blocks from the edge of a storm-bitten cliff. The pendulum leaves receipts everywhere if we are willing to read them in the hush. Oxygen in shells that knew a colder sea, carbon in marsh that knew a warmer air, the absence of a grain size where the river braided differently. Not because certainty is the point, but because even partial truths can be restful when they hold. We allow ourselves a soft speculation. Hidden cities folded into shelves, their timbers soaked and turned to dark leather, their stones settled into companionship with clams and tube worms, their streets mapped by the shadows of schooling fish. One day, millions of years from now, long after ice has come and gone again, long after mountains elsewhere have been made and unmade, an orogeny may lift this floor and stand it in the sun, and the ledger that was horizontal will be opened upright. There, a thin line of a harbor's cobbles may skip across a cliff like punctuation. There, the foundation of a warehouse may speak in rectangles the rain can read. There, a quiet layer of soot may narrow the geologist's eyes as a thought forms about a brief, bright century. Maybe not. And the kindness is that we do not need to know. The continent remembers even what we forget, and it does so without judgment. We pause with the idea that forgetting is also a care. Silt softens sharp edges so that fish can nest. Dunes fill the rooms so that wind can sleep. Mangroves braid the shoreline into a net that holds the day's small lives with tender fingers. Entropy works, yes, but not as a vandal. More like weathering in a library where the librarian straightens the pages each evening so the morning can begin again. What if memory, at the coast, is a practice of rearrangement, a cyclical tidying where nothing is truly lost, only translated into another place, another depth, another page. Night leans in. We let the lost coasts breathe through the present ones. The hiss of a wave on pebbles that were once a street, the pause before a gull's call where a bell might have been, the way the tide line curves around a remnant of something we can't quite name. In this calm, the continents feel like vast keepers of rooms, unlocking and relocking doors at the pace of breath, trusting the shelves to hold what the surface cannot carry for now. We are small in this company, and being small is a relief. We walk the water's edge and allow it to rewrite our steps even as we make them, an agreement made and remade with each arrival and retreat. And yet, if coasts can erase to keep, and shelves can hide to remember, what else is stored in the planet's deeper vaults? The echoes under mountains and the silhouettes beneath basins, that might guide these very edges without ever touching light? Perhaps the next gentle path is to trace those echoes, to listen with earthquakes and stillness, and to feel how the interior draws its slow lines on the outside, inviting us to read the sea's handwriting by the shadows it casts from below. And yet, if coasts can erase to keep, and shelves can hide to remember, what else is stored in the planet's deeper vaults? The echoes under mountains and the silhouettes beneath basins, that might guide these very edges without ever touching light? We follow that question inward until thought feels like a hand against cool glass, until the noise of surface days softens to a low interior hum, and the world begins to arrange itself as memory not in words, but in shapes. What if a planet remembers through its structure? Faults like healed seams that open when stress returns, cratons like elder bones that keep a posture for 1 billion years, sediments like notes that hold the last breath of a vanished rain. Not because stone can think, but because stable patterns behave like what we call thought. They persist, they influence, they return. Maybe, maybe not, and still the map's long grammar suggests that matter keeps a kind of intentionless intention, a discipline of form that outlives the things that made it. We walk with the idea gently, the way one walks along an old wall whose stones still fit like a sentence remembered by the hands that placed them. Faults are the planet's cursive scars. They slip and hold, storing strain like unspoken lines, and releasing it in brief stutters that send messages through the body in waves. Those waves, traveling invisibly, sketch the shapes beneath. Slabs curved like folded letters, plumes rising like slow, bright commas, roots of mountains hanging deep as afterthoughts that are really beginnings. Could it be that the path a wave takes is not only a report but a rehearsal? That the next motion will follow the old corridor because the corridor exists, and existence itself is a form of memory? The crust listens to those corridors. Rivers favor them. Valleys deepen there. Cities unknowingly find their streets along them, and all of this is less destiny than familiarity, a quiet preference for the grooves already worn. Cratons sit at the heart of this patience like steady vowels in a language otherwise crowded with consonants. Thick, cool, dry, depleted of what would make them soft. They keep their posture while belts around them bend and sing, and in that keeping they influence everything that leans against them. Winds skirting their heights, storms finding their edges, glaciers slowing on their shoulders as if respectful of old ground. They hold diamonds like preserved thoughts, bits of carbon pressed into clarity and kept in the keel's calm until a volcano lifts them like brief memories to the mouth of day. Is it possible to call this mineral thought? A metaphor, yes, and still a useful one, where thought means a durable arrangement shaped by conditions and then shaping conditions in return. The craton does not decide. It endures and endurance directs. Sediments make the softer memory, the melody to the craton's drone. Layer after layer, they archive the dialects of weather and life, allowing floods to rhyme with older floods, allowing droughts to echo ancient silences in ash and charcoal and salt. In the long stacks, rhythm is information, and repetition is recall. Varves whisper annual snows. Crossbeds murmur of winds that never tired. A thin line of silt records a far volcano's brief punctuation. Not because the planet prefers poetry, but because physics cannot help leaving meter where cycles touch matter. We read these measures as if listening at a door in a quiet hall, the conversation inside continuing whether or not we understand every word. The cadence enough to tell us that a memory is being kept for any who arrive with patience. Entropy walks beside this persistence, a courteous companion with a gentle aim to blur. Edges soften, fractures widen, differences diffuse. And yet layered order persists, not by resisting change, but by changing in ways that keep the pattern recognizable. A fault accumulates new slickensides that parallel the old. A mountain renews its skyline at lower altitude but keeps the contour of its fable. A basin fills and subsides and fills again, each chapter placed atop the last, each title different but the binding the same. What if identity here is not essence but habit? a path worn into matter that guides new journeys along old lines with an ease that feels like knowing. Maybe, maybe not, but the comfort is real. Even vanishing leaves traces that can be traced again. We bring the atmosphere into this thought and watch how it folds into rock as if rock were a lung and air a memory. Oxygen finds iron and writes color into sediments. Carbon finds calcium and writes limestone out of tides and time. Sulfur finds pyrite and leaves sharp, delicate grains that hold the chemistry of ancient seas the way a photograph holds light. Later, when mountains rise, these stones meet the weather they once recorded, as if reading their own diaries aloud on a hillside, and in reading, offer minerals back to rivers that will carry them to new pages. The cycle is not circular in a strict way. It is helical, advancing while it returns, adding small inflections that become the difference between epochs, and in those inflections thought again, not conscious, not choosing, but cumulative. Beneath us, subduction rehearses its careful script. A slab bends and bears a cargo of memory. Ooze and basalt and the isotopic whispers of a surface life. Down into warmth where details dissolve into potential. Water is released. Mantle melts. Arcs rise. Continents are stitched, unstitched, restitched, and each seam has its handwriting recognizable to those who read textures and trace elements as one reads familiar faces. Could it be that mineral thought is not the property of a single crystal but the emergent calm of many arrangements agreeing on a direction? Granite that learned to float. Peridotite that learned to resist. Clay that learned to hold. Agreement without committee, order without plan, meaning without a mind, and yet, meaning enough to navigate by. We rest our attention on a single zircon, on a single fault scarp, on a single layer of lakebed clay holding a summer's bright pollen. And we feel how these small things can anchor a story too wide to see at once. A half-life is a lullaby. A wave path is a sentence. A bed of shells is a paragraph that cannot be hurried. When pressure comes, some pages reset and others remain. When fluids pass, some margins blur and others are underlined. When heat returns, the book does not burn, it is revised. This is not immortality. It is a patience that wins by staying available, by being ready to be read in whatever light tomorrow allows. Dust holds its place a little longer, and that may be enough. What was stardust became planet, what was rock became raft, what was raft became field, what was field became bread. And the crumb that falls returns as silt to the river that will someday stand upright as cliff and tell a traveler what the weather felt like here when no one listened. Not because the world owes us a story, but because story is what stable patterns look like from the inside. We breathe out and the air answers. Rain falls and the rock replies. Waves come and the shore remembers how to curve. Maybe mineral thought is only our way of loving the quiet that survives its causes. Maybe not. And still the phrase fits softly like a stone in the hand with the right weight. And yet, if structure can keep a memory without mind, if patterns can behave like thought and help the world recall itself across forgotten epochs, what might the deep echoes be telling us now? Those seismic murmurs that draw the outlines of hidden rooms and invisible rivers beneath our feet. Perhaps the next gentle listening is to follow the echo into the mantle's hall, to let the darkness sketch its shapes in sound, and to feel how the maps we live upon are written, over and over, by handwriting we can only read when we slow down enough to hear it. And yet, if structure can keep a memory without mind, if patterns can behave like thought and help the world recall itself across forgotten epochs, what might the deep echoes be telling us now? Those seismic murmurs that draw the outlines of hidden rooms and invisible rivers beneath our feet. We lean into that question and let sound, not light, become our lantern. Earthquakes speak in pulses that spread like ripples through a dark lake, and as they pass, rocks answer differently. Stiff here, slower there. A little cooler in one corridor, a little warmer in another. And from those differences a picture gathers, not a painting but a patient blur that sharpens when many voices overlay the same hall. Not because the planet reveals itself easily, but because repetition is kindness. The more times a wave crosses a secret, the more solid the secret becomes in our listening. Could it be that the mantle is a room of echoes writing a map on the inside of the world, and we are learning to read by ear? We follow the fastest waves first, the crisp ones that hurry through rigid stone and slow in softer reaches, and then the rolling ones that sway like a heavy curtain and take their time deciding how to pass through tight places. The differences are small, but over the long paths from quake to station, they add up the way raindrops make a river, and the river becomes a coastline we can trace. Cold slabs descend like long, cool tongues, keeping their composure far below where light could ever reach. Hot columns rise like quiet lanterns, broad at depth, narrowing as they rise, pausing to widen again beneath thin crust as if remembering an open sky they will never see. Maybe, maybe not, and still the images repeat from many angles, until the guess becomes a gentle conviction. The interior is not chaos but weather, a slow pattern of sinks and lifts, a convection written in stone. We feel our attention lower to a trench where a slab bows and slides into warmer dark, and the echoes there sharpen, tracing an elegant arc downward that continues like a signature curling into the deep. The slab is cooler and therefore quicker for a while. It carries its chill like a letter folded tight, and the waves that pass through it hurry, then slacken when they leave. Far beneath, at boundaries where minerals change their crystal habits, some slabs flatten like clouds that have met a still layer and spread, and there the echoes broaden as if the hall had opened into a gallery. Above, where heat lifts and softens mantle rock, the waves slow, and the image brightens into a column that suggests a plume, an artery of warmth feeding a distant swell and, perhaps, a chain of islands that arc across the surface like the stitched hem of an old cloak. We listen to continents without touching them. Their keels hang deep, cool and buoyant, and the echoes catch their edges the way wind catches the corners of a tent. In some places those roots are thick and calm, making the waves quicken as if grateful for the clarity. In others the roots are thinner or frayed, and the waves meander, hinting that the raft may be more easily tugged by the dark rivers below. Is it possible that the quiet below chooses the quiet above, not like a command, but like a hand steadying a bowl of water so the surface can settle into whatever shape the vessel allows? The drift of granite rafts begins to feel less like wandering and more like being escorted, nudged by low, patient currents whose channels we trace by their echoes' delays. There are rooms within rooms. At certain depths the lattice of mantle minerals flips its arrangement, and the speed of sound changes abruptly, a clean threshold as sure as a doorway in a dim house. Waves reflect and refract at these boundaries, and from their bending we learn the ceiling heights of unseen halls. In some places, the ceiling sags beneath the weight of a cold slab. In others, it bulges upward under the push of a plume, and continents above those bulges may rise a little, enough to invite rivers to start from new places and coasts to lean into new curves. Not because the mantle speaks with intention, but because structure pushes on structure until a form appears, and the form persuades the surface to follow. We soften our listening further, toward the tiny wiggles that arrive last, scattered and tangled by roughness far below. Scattering is a kind of whispering. Small crystals aligned by flow, patches of melt held like dew on a web, fragments of ancient slabs crumpled into a shadowy plain. These textures are the quietest notes, and yet they hint at memory kept in fabrics, the way a well-worn path holds a footstep. Could it be that the mantle remembers where it has flowed, and that memory guides the next stream, so that rafts of granite, trusting without knowing, drift along familiar dark roads? Even silence speaks. In some places, waves arrive too cleanly, as if there were fewer rough edges to tangle them. In others, they blur, as if heat had softened angles into kindness. The absence of a scatter can be as telling as a peak on a graph. The lack of a reflection can be the presence of a window. We are not forced to claims. We rest with likelihoods that grow warmer with each event, each passing, each night of listening. Entropy leans on the map, wanting to smear it, but the planet's steady beating quakes near and far, refreshes it, draws it again, keeps the edges from dissolving completely. What if the world's interior is always sketching itself anew, and we only need to arrive often enough to see through the drafts? When we return our gaze to the living map above, faults and ranges, shelves and basins, it feels different because we have felt their shadows below. A mountain belt is a long reply to an echo. A rift is the handwriting of a slow rising beneath. A tranquil shield is a paragraph resting on a deep, clear consonant that does not slur. The quiet below writes the quiet above, and the script is legible if we are willing to let sound become sight, if we are willing to trust that patience can draw a picture in motion. And yet, If echoes can guide the continents without a voice, if the dark halls beneath our feet are composing the surface in a key we can barely hear, what else might the waves be tracing that we have not yet learned to read? What future breath of a supercontinent? What faint gathering of a pulse that will close one ocean and open another? Perhaps the next gentle turn is to count not only the echoes, but the intervals between them, and to listen for a rhythm within the rhythm. A pulse that will carry the rafts together again, softly, as the night turns one more patient page. And yet, if echoes can guide the continents without a voice, if the dark halls beneath our feet are composing the surface in a key we can barely hear, what else might those waves be tracing that we have not yet learned to read? What breath of sky folded into stone? What sip of weather sealed in a grain? We let the listening rise from the mantle to the skin of the world, where rain writes its chemistry into rock and never fully leaves. Ancient showers still glimmer as memory caught in tiny prisons. Fluid inclusions in quartz, in halite, in calcite, minute droplets that hold a sky no longer present, a temperature no longer felt, a softness or sharpness of acidity that once stroked the land with a particular touch. Not because water wished to be archived, but because crystals closed around it as they grew, and in closing made a time capsule. A bubble of air, a speck of brine, a trace of a storm that rolled across a continent still learning the shape of its edges. We tilt a crystal and watch the captive bubble move, sluggish and precise, and a thermometer flickers to life in the mind. The droplet's behavior tells of heat or cool, of pressure in a deep pocket or a shallow vein, of salinity inherited from a sea that has since become limestone or a lake evaporated to salt and light. Could it be that every rain has a flavor, and that flavor can be tasted long after the clouds have fallen silent? Maybe, maybe not, and still the numbers are gentle and sure. Oxygen isotopes leaning lighter when air cooled and ice grew broad, heavier when warmth returned and the horizon softened. Hydrogen tracing the path of vapor from ocean to highland, from monsoon to rain shadow, from breath to stone. Clay remembers differently, as if the soil itself had kept a diary in its lattice. When feldspar loosens under weather and relents into kaolinite or smectite, the crystal structure quietly edits the isotopes it welcomes and the ones it lets pass. In those edits is a record of acidity and season, of the linger time of water in a horizon, of carbonic whispers from roots and leaves that breathed a particular air under a particular sky. We lift a thin smear of clay to light and, though it looks like nothing but dull earth, it speaks in ratios of oxygen and hydrogen, in the orientation of its plates, in trace metals that shadow the pH of vanished rain. Is it possible that rock remembers whether the way skin remembers touch? Subtle, lasting, not always visible, but unmistakable if you know where to look? We walk across a plain that was once a seabed and sense salt the way a story senses an old theme. In halite crystals, tiny pockets of brine remain, and within them microscopic life sometimes lingers beyond reason, as if persistence itself were a mineral. The brine's chemistry points back to the sea that left it. Magnesium and sulfate telling of evaporation under a fierce sun, bromine whispering concentration, strontium hinting at the rivers that fed the basin. The rain that fell on the shore had its own tone then, perhaps slightly more acidic under a volcanic sky, perhaps sweeter where forests drank greedily and handed carbon back to the clouds. We taste this through time by proxy, not with tongue but with care. An inclusion heated until it pops, a gas measured in a spectrometer's hush, a ratio compared to another ratio until the pattern decides to stand in place. Every sip of data is small, and that smallness is the comfort. A stalagmite grows in breaths, drop by drop, its layers bright or dim with the cadence of storm and drought. Within the calcite, the oxygen record leans with temperature, with the path water took through soil, with the mood of the forest above. The cave is a slow mouth, drinking the rain and then speaking it back, centuries later. In rings we can read with lamps and patience. Not because the cave means to teach, but because seepage is faithful and stone is a good listener. We find these voices beneath deserts and under mountains, in karst that cradles ancient drips, and in each we hear a climate clearing its throat across forgotten epochs. The continents were these flavors unevenly, an old shield holding the memory of gentle, acidic rains over thin soils. A young ark recalling volcanic breaths that pricked the water's pH. A drowned shelf turned cliff telling of warm, quiet oceans that sang carbonate into beaches that are now stairways for gulls. Entropy is present here, 2. Softening edges, dissolving and reprecipitating, blurring where clarity had once been sharp. And yet the layered order persists. Clays stack, carbonates accrete, inclusions seal. Ice buries bubbles of air that we can lift and listen to as if the sky itself had sent us letters on blue paper. We let a thought return to the first clouds over newborn continents. Steam rising from a world just past fire. Rain learning the taste of bare basalt and nascent granite. Acids mild and strong in turn as the air decided what it wanted to be. Could it be that those first showers altered the crust and, in altering, set the stage for soils to gather, for rivers to carry, for life to find a foothold on a surface tuned to receive it? Maybe, maybe not. But the earliest zircons hint at water's presence. The oldest clays murmur of weather touching rock while the planet still wore its youth. In these hints is relief. The sky and the ground learn to speak to one another, and their conversation is ongoing, quiet, and sustaining. We sip carefully because reverence prefers small cups. A drop in a crystal, a ratio in a clay, a line in a stalagmite's heart. Each is enough to draw a contour on a map of time too large to hold all at once. Rock remembers rain as chemistry, and chemistry translates to feeling if we give it room. We can almost taste the cool of a glacial morning, the metallic hint of dust riding a distant wind. The sweetness after a long drought breaks and the first fat drops strike the earth like soft punctuation. The continents do not boast of these memories. They carry them in pores and plains, patient and exact. And yet, if a single droplet can keep the weather of a vanished day, if clays can hold the breath of forests that no longer stand, what shapes might those kept flavors take when the ground lifts and the seabed faces sky? What stories of rain will sit exposed in tilted strata, inviting us to read the atmosphere as we read fossils, letter by letter, layer by layer, as the night turns and a new question begins to form on the horizon of thought? And yet, if a single droplet can keep the weather of a vanished day, if clays can hold the breath of forests that no longer stand, what shapes will rise when those quiet pages are folded upward and placed in the light? What script will stone write when the ground is asked to speak in height instead of depth? We follow the question to where two continents lean toward each other like old friends who have learned to meet without hurry. At first, there is distance. Then there is the suggestion of approach. And then, over a span so gentle it becomes a lullaby, the crust begins to shorten and thicken. Not because it is forced to be dramatic, but because balance invites a new form. Ridges gather like thoughts collecting at the front of the mind. Snow finds the first high shoulders and decides to stay. Rivers are woken by the tilt, and they begin rehearsing the long descent with a patience that will one day be called a valley. The first touch is not a crack but a fold. Layers leaning into one another as if to share warmth. Sediment turned upright like a book opened to a forgotten page. The pressure rises like tide in the dark. Minerals greet it by changing. Calcite to marble, shale to slate, basalt to greenstone. Each alteration a way of keeping identity while bending to circumstance. Could it be that metamorphism is the planet's quiet method for resetting the clock without erasing the time already lived? A gentle recalibration that says, "You are still you, only arranged to endure this next depth? Maybe, maybe not." And still the story remains legible in textures and twins and inclusions that survive the squeeze. Underneath, roots grow downward even as peaks reach for light. Mass answering mass in a symmetry that is easy to forget when clouds hide the summit and footsteps only know the surface. Those roots hold strain like coiled time, a potential stored in density, a memory of collisions kept for a future day when erosion will remove the burden and isostasy will let the land rise again like a breath taken after a long sentence. Lightning can be loud, but mountain lightning is years deep and whisper quiet. It lives where minerals realign to face new stress, where garnet blooms like slow embers in schist, where mica learns to lie in plains that gleam when the sun lowers and the slope turns to language. At the crest, snow arranges itself into cornices and softens the harshest lines, then melts and leaves oxygen signatures in the threads of rivers that carry them away as if they were secrets that want to be kept by the sea. Along the way, frost steps carefully into cracks at dusk and returns as ice by dawn, not rupturing out of anger, but opening a little more room each night for water to sit and think. The cliff flinches and then relents. A block joins the talus becomes a stair, and the stair is climbed by lichen first, then by the seed of a spruce that was patient enough to wait in a pocket of shadow and wind. Entropy is present always, but here it feels like kindness, the breaking that allows a slope to hold more life than a sheer wall ever could. In valleys where glaciers practice the alphabet of pressure, the U-shape becomes a hymn about weight and movement sung in cold syllables of blue and white. Rock flour clouds the melt as it rushes, and downstream the water is the color of memory. A soft, suspended gray that settles into deltas where fish learn to write their lives. Moraines are punctuation, commas where the ice paused, periods where it stopped, semicolons where it considered returning, and each mark will last longer than the grammar of any town that builds itself on the sunny side of the slope. Is it possible that a mountain is not built once but continually rewritten? A living manuscript held in the hands of weather and gravity, each revision deeper and truer than the last? When storms lift from the coast and lean into the range, the air spills itself along the ridgelines and leaves its rain on the windward face. The leeward side learns the word shadow and spells it in sage and dust, in soils that ask roots to travel farther between sips. Climate arranges its offices across the relief. Moss and cedar on one wall, juniper and grass on the other. A hallway of high meadows between them where pollen chooses the summer and stones warm their backs under dragonflies that know the exact height of the day. In this arrangement, fossils are rare near the crest but beloved in the foothills. Shells held in sandstones that were once beaches, leaves pressed into shales that were once quiet lakes beneath the rising shade of new height. Each leaf is a soft negative of light that no longer exists, and still it calms the eye. Sometimes the mountain speaks in a different tempo. An earthquake loosens what frost had nearly convinced. A rockslide takes 100 winters in a single afternoon and lays them out in sunlight like laundry. A river changes lanes and tidies its meander into a straighter thought for a season or a century. Not because the story wishes to startle, but because stored strain offers to be useful, and the slope is grateful to redistribute its weight. Even then, the deeper pulse is unbroken. Uplift, weather, transport, deposit. A cycle that mothers deltas far away, where silt learns to balance on salt water and marsh grass begins to stitch the edges of a new page. Dust ascends, then returns as sand. A peak that was once seabed stands against a sky that was once unfamiliar, and from its flanks grains begin the long walk home to the coast, a pilgrimage measured in bends and resting places. Along that walk, isotopes in the sand recall the parentage of the stones they left, a faint accent that persists even after many crossings and grindings. Could it be that identity, for a mountain, is the ability to be recognized in the language of a beach 1,000 miles from the crest, a whisper in quartz that says I was pressure, I was height, I am still a story? Night lowers like a kind hand. The range holds its silhouette against stars that were already ancient when the first uplift began. The rivers continue their soft, bright talk. We let the mind stand in thin air and feel how the earth, even at its most towering, moves in a register that invites rest. And yet, if heights are only the quiet expression of old collisions, if every summit is already on its way to the sea, what does that say about the shelves where continents breathe? About the low, calm places that receive the sand and keep it in bands of story, waiting for the next turn of the world to lift them into light? We walk softly to the margin where land loosens its grip and lets water share the work, where rivers finish their long sentences in a hush and lay down their cargo grain by grain. Passive margins spread wide and patient here, a pale, slowly sloping plain that seems like stillness from above but is busy as a library at dusk. Each new bed a careful placement on a growing shelf. Not because the edge has no power, but because its power is distributed, lent to currents that sort and sift, to tides that smooth and stack, to storm surges that write bold lines and then retreat. Rivers arrive as if exhaling, weighted with feldspar and quartz, mica and clay, bits of mountains turned portable by time. Their mouths braid and unbraid, building deltas that look like hands opening to the sea, each finger a channel with its own mood, each nail a sandbar where a fledgling learns the word wind. Beyond the delta, where waves and deeper currents take over, the load fans outward and downward into graded silence. Coarse nearer, finer farther, turbid flows spilling off the shelf edge now and then like quiet avalanches of silt and shell. Could it be that this is where the continents speak most clearly, Not in height but in patience. Not in singular peaks but in layered consent. Maybe, maybe not. And still the pattern reads as breath. The land breathes out and the shelf receives. Here, fossils are comfortable, held in beds so gentle they feel like sleep. Leaves settle with perfect veins intact. Fish find their shape preserved between thin laminae as if the water itself remembered the outline. Tiny foraminifera snow down by the trillions, each shell a note in a soft symphony that measures temperature and salt and the tilt of seasons. Monsoons leave thicker, darker bands. Droughts leave pale, whisper-thin lines. Floods drop coarse punctuation that no one can mistake. In the long stacks, forests appear as lignite seams where swamps lingered, then are replaced by chalk where the sea grew clear and warm, then again by mud that knew a river's return. Not because cycles require perfect repetition, but because the shelf inclines toward memory in physics and in feeling. Shelves grow and shelves collapse. Sometimes the weight of their own success tips them at the edge, and submarine canyons carve down the slope, guiding torrents of dense, sediment-rich water into the deeper dark. Those flows lay blankets on abyssal plains, flat as thoughts at midnight, miles from any shore. Other times, the sea rises while the land relaxes, and the shoreline migrates inland like a tide that refuses to be punctual, drowning old marshes and making new ones farther up the valley. Mangroves knit the margin into a living sieve. Salt marsh builds itself centimeter by centimeter with every tide's quiet donation. Reefs hang a bright fringe where water is warm enough to practice limestone spoken fluently. Is it possible that this lung at the edge of stone has the softest resilience of all, altering its rooms without losing the house? We listen for the shelf's distant weather. Storms braid sand into bars and undo them by morning. Swells sort pebbles by size along shoals that come and go like careful breathwork. Longshore currents pull aslant at the lip and carry grains along coasts until a headland interrupts and makes a small sentence of beach, a pause in motion where stories collect. The chemistry answers too. Carbonate grows where life is lavish. Silica rules where rivers dominate. Iron writes rusty stains where upwelling brings ancient breath from the deep. Entropy is everywhere, loosening clumps, thinning edges, mixing moods, and yet order reappears as lamination, cross-bedding, ripples, as if the system prefers its patterns not rigid but reiterative. In cross-section, the shelf is a diary that turns itself slowly, pairing old pages at the seaward edge while adding new ones at the landward rim. Transgressions flood ink inland. Regressions draw the line seaward. Sequences stack like chapters of a quiet epic. Shore-face sands at the base, foreshore swash marks like italics, lagoonal muds like the margins where small creatures left their careful annotations. We can read sea level without seeing the sea. We can taste climate in the shell's oxygen. We can hear distant mountains in the mineralogy of a single grain. What if identity for a shoreline is not a border but a habit of arrival, always here, always elsewhere, always in translation? At night, the shelf glows with lives that do not seek the surface. Plankton rise and fall on a deal tide, trading depths with stars. Fish follow cool tongues of water that slide along the bottom like subtle weather. Worms knit galleries in mud where each thread is a slow decision about where oxygen can reach and how carbon will be kept. Their work changes the sediment's breath, shifts redox fronts like curtains, writes chemistry into texture. Maybe the gentlest archives are these invisible rooms, where the quietest hands turn silt and, in turning, set a page that will stand for ages. The continents breathe out, then draw the sea back in. On long scales, the shelf is a moving porch, sometimes broad and sunlit, sometimes narrow and steep, sometimes drowned and dreamful, always keeping time with ice and mantle, with wind and river, with forces that never ask for permission because their politeness is in their pace. Dust arrives, rests, and is arranged. Later, the arrangement is asked to stand upright under a loftier sky, where it will name itself sandstone, shale, limestone, and let rain read it line by line. We do not need to insist upon the destination. The shelf knows it will one day be terrace, then cliff, then talus, then sand again. And yet, if the edge can inhale and exhale entire forests and seas without losing its composure, if beds can hold storms and summers side by side and still feel like quiet, what happens when the ocean chooses the shore, when basins open and close and the tide line is redrawn by the deep decisions of stone? Perhaps the next soft turn is to follow that choosing, to listen as ridges push and trenches pull, and to feel how the sea and the continent negotiate their meeting with a patience that can only be called kind. And yet, if the edge can inhale and exhale entire forests and seas without losing its composure, if beds can hold storms and summers side by side and still feel like quiet, what happens when the ocean chooses the shore, when basins open and close and the tide line is redrawn by the deep decisions of stone? We lower our voice and walk along that moving boundary, where maps are only suggestions and the real lines are drawn by heat and mass taking their time. Under the waves, ridges lift like long, low spines, and new floor cools as it travels outward, growing heavier until it bows its head. In another room of the planet, trenches receive that weight and return it to warmth. Not because the sea is fickle, but because Earth is practicing balance, and balance favors motion. Could it be that every coastline is a conversation between buoyancy and gravity, a patient negotiation that writes itself in dunes and cliffs, in marshes that advance by inches, in headlands that step back a grain at a time? We listen to ridges push, not loudly but steadily, as basalt forms and slides away on conveyor belts of rock we cannot see. A basin widens. Currents find new corridors. The swell of young crust quietly lifts the sea surface into a subtle dome, and water answers this hill of heat with a circle of winds and gyres that carry warmth shoreward here and draw it away there. Maybe, maybe not, and yet the climate hears these decisions. Fog where cold tongues brush a coast, rain where warm streams meet mountain walls, deserts cast in the lee of ranges that rose because plates collided long ago and asked the shoreline to learn a new curve. When the basin narrows again, older floor sinking, margins drawing near, the arc of islands and the scallop of trenches sculpt a different edge, carving bays where subduction pulls the crust down and raising volcanic shoulders where melt returns as quiet light. Shorelines are decisions made by mass as much as by wind. When ice leans upon a continent, the land bows. When ice retreats, the bow rises back in slow relief, and beaches that once knew gulls at eye level stand as terraces above a newer tide. We walk along stairsteps cut in stone, old strandlines lifted by isostasy, and each step is a patient announcement that weight has shifted. Rivers answer by changing their voices, cutting new mouths where the gradient invites, abandoning old channels to sleep beneath reeds and herons. Is it possible that the coast, which looks like a border, is really the most flexible part of the world? The part that remembers how to bend without breaking, how to erase without forgetting. We kneel where a longshore current writes sideways, carrying sand like a sentence that never stops, curling it into spits that reach across bays with the persistence of a hand wanting to hold. Storms interrupt with bold edits, carving in a night what fair weather laid down in a year, but even storms bow to the average, and the average is a hush that prefers curves. In deltas, the ocean can be kind and stern in the same hour, welcoming fresh water as it fans outward, then pushing back with a tide that reminds the river to keep its courage. Dust is always negotiating with water. A grain settles, a wave questions, a grain moves, a patch of calm persuades it to stay. The ledger records both attempts without judgment. Beneath the surface, slopes tilt into dark where submarine canyons send pulses of sand and silt down like quiet avalanches. A shelf break steps the bottom into deeper room. A turbidity current hurries along a path carved by its predecessors. Farther out, the abyss waits, level and patient, for what the margin will decide to release. Not because the deep demands tribute, but because somewhere gravity needs a place to rest the things that cannot stay high. In time, these blankets of fine grain become flat archives where the ocean's mood is stored, thin lines for calm periods, thicker for restless spells, a diary that will matter to cliffs no one can see yet. Sometimes the ocean chooses the shore with heat alone. When currents slacken or reroute, sea ice retreats or advances, storms favor one season more than another, and the edge answers with a different posture. Barrier islands migrating like slow thought, lagoons opening and closing their eyes, salt marshes inching seaward on the backs of their own roots, then stepping landward when the sea asks them to. We see fossils perched where no tide reaches now, oysters high on a wall, coral stairways along uplifted coasts, and understand that the present is a pause between drafts. Could it be that the most honest way to love a shoreline is to let it change? We hold a fingertip to a map and feel it warm where the ridge lies, cool where the trench deepens, and we imagine the coast's response like breath. Inhaling when the basin offers room, exhaling when the plates lean in. The river mouth learns a new vowel. The bay turns a different shade of green. The wind, redirected by a headland newly born of uplift, carries rain to a hillside that did not expect it. Entropy rolls through all of it, softly blurring the sharpest letters, but organization reappears as bars and cusps, as ripples and crossbeds, as beaches arranged by size the way a careful hand sorts beads. At night, the shore is a listening place. Waves write, pause, write again, and the pause is as informative as the word. The moon leans and the tide rises as if remembering an old appointment. The tide falls and reveals sand that shows the last small lives who crossed it. A thin script erased by the next arrival. We step back and let the scale grow until continents and oceans feel like partners in a long dance where steps repeat without rigidity, guiding each other more than leading, taking turns with grace. The shore is where we can see the courtesy. And yet, if heat and mass can redraw the map with such patience, if dust and water can bargain their way toward shapes that feel inevitable only after they arrive, what does that say about the long pulse that gathers lands together and lets them go? The rhythm that opens and closes oceans until even the coasts seem to remember a larger breath? Perhaps the next soft question is to stand with that pulse, to feel its timing in rifts and sutures, and to listen as a distant drum calls the shorelines we know toward a meeting they have kept across forgotten epochs. And yet, if heat and mass can redraw the map with such patience, if dust and water can bargain their way toward shapes that feel inevitable only after they arrive, what kind of memory waits where the continents show their oldest face? What survives when almost everything else has been carried away? We step onto the shields as if into a library without walls, under a sky that feels older than the names for blue. The ground is crystalline and calm, banded gneiss and quiet granite, amphibolites with green dusk in them, migmatites where stone remembered melting and then stopped just short of forgetting itself. Not because drama is absent, but because its afterimage has been polished into steadiness. A grain that runs true for meters, for miles, for lifetimes. Time is unhurried here. Identity is quiet and strong. Weather takes the first pass like a careful reader removing dust from a page. Frost lifts and lays back the corners. Heat loosens tiny seams. Rain enters patiently and leaves with a few ions folded in its sleeve. Rivers polish what remains with an artisan's devotion, rounding knobs into low backs that hold sun at evening, combing fractures until only the oldest words are left. Could it be that erosion, which seems like loss, is also a kind of restoration, an unveiling that lets the earliest sentences breathe? Maybe, maybe not, and still the eye adjusts to the simple boldness of quartz ribbons, to feldspar's soft light, to biotite's dark handwriting along planes that cleave as if they had been waiting for a fingertip. These hard pages keep margins where small lives have written footnotes. Lichens map slow continents of color across feldspar fields. Black spruce find a crack and grow there, thin and faithful. Caribou hooves gloss a path that gleams in low sun. Between summer and winter, silence keeps a steady key. Wind rehearses a scale against the same shoulders of stone and never grows tired of the melody. The shield is not empty. It is precise. It says, "Here is what remained when the mantle tugged and the weather asked and the rivers negotiated. Here is a keel showing at the surface, a spine resting after the long swim of eras. Beneath our feet, isotopes hum without hurry, their half-lives stretching like dark cloth in a room with one candle. Zircons nested in these rocks hold sparks of mornings no one could have seen. Neodymium leans old, strontium leans certain. Lead sits at the end of a long sentence written by uranium with a patience that feels like devotion. We do not need to count tonight to trust the ages. The body knows when a place is older than memory, and the mind is willing to sit down and listen without interrupting. Is it possible that identity in stone is simply consistency across unthinkable lengths? Patterns that were not erased when everything around them rehearsed other shapes? Here and there, a glacial erratic rests like a borrowed thought, carried from somewhere else and left on this exact line. A punctuation boulder placed by a quiet that moved mountains without hurrying. On some ledges, Scratches run parallel as if a hand had drawn them with a blade to mark direction. On others, thin soils gather in shallow bowls, and blueberries appear in indigo clusters that concentrate the sky. When rain comes, it smells clean and mineral, as if the air were reading aloud the names of feldspars. When it leaves, small rivulets linger on polished flutings carved by ice older than our oldest tale. Entropy is here, yes, but slowed to a pace that becomes companionship rather than threat. Shields are not proud. They are present. The light falls differently, because there is less to catch it and more to return it in long, low plains. At noon, the stone grows warm and keeps that warmth into evening. At night, it gives it back with a kindness that invites sleep to settle even on bare ground. Ravens cross the distance as if teaching the scale of this room. A fox writes a red line along a seam. A mosquito insists on being part of the archive because even insistence, for a minute, is a form of record. We accept the small discomforts as proof of being allowed here. Not because suffering is noble, but because exposure reminds us that endurance can be gentle. Sometimes a thin lake fits itself along a joint, dark as a thought that has learned to be still. Its shores are stone, softened by centuries of kneeling water, and along the margin, a fringe of sedge acknowledges the compromise between root and bedrock. In winter, ice takes a draft of the lake's shape and makes it audible. A crack races across, soft thunder like a memory loosening, and then the silence returns with a fresh vocabulary of light. We stand and wonder if the earliest continents felt like this when they first learned to bear, whether rough letters becoming script, script becoming story, story becoming habit. The shield is a teacher of proportion. Standing on it, the measure of a day becomes the angle of sun along a ribbon of quartz. The measure of a year becomes the depth of thaw. The measure of a life becomes the path between two lichen islands and back again with someone's hand in ours. Could it be that self-erasure, the way soft parts leave and hard parts remain, carries a lesson about memory we can use, a way of keeping the center while letting the edges change their mind when they must? Maybe, maybe not. And still the heart lifts at the humility of a land that does not need to prove anything to be real. Evening gathers as a kind of blessing. The rocks keep their low warmth. The mosquitoes thin. The first stars arrive with a modesty that suits a place where the oldest words are whispered. We rest with these texts in that light and understand that time is not pressing us forward. It is allowing us to be held. The shield will be here when we wake, and if we step lightly, it will welcome us again without remark. The story will not hurry to its next page, and we do not ask it to. And yet, if identity can be this quiet and still endure, if the first sentences can keep their grain while the world writes over them and then wears the ink away, what other chapters lie exposed in the open air? What shelves where continents breathe, what river-written ledgers, what sky-faced fossils, waiting for us to arrive with the same unhurried attention, to read without rushing, to let the night turn the page for us. And yet, if identity can be this quiet and still endure, if the first sentences can keep their grain while the world writes over them and then wears the ink away, what other measures can we hold without breaking? What happens when the map moves beneath the calendar, when the hour and the eon share the same room and do not interrupt each other? We turn toward the drift with a softness that suits sleep, letting plates move at the tempo they prefer, faster than fingernails grow, slower than families remember, and still, across enough nights, the distances become oceans. Not because the earth loves distance, but because space is a kind of patience, and patience is how forms learn to meet themselves again. We keep company with a thought that does not hurry. This is not drama, but kindness, time giving everything space. Dust waits without complaint. We picture a continent as a quiet raft with a deep keel, thick and light enough to float on a mantle river that never raises its voice. The raft does not choose its path. It answers warmth with a small shift, answers the tug of a sinking slab with a patient lean, answers a rising plume with a subtle lift that may take 1,000,000 years to mean anything to the eye. Could it be that our sense of stillness is only the scale at which drift is kind, that motion this measured is a form of care, an allowance that keeps forests from moving all at once, that lets rivers revise their courses without waking their banks in alarm? Maybe, maybe not. And still, when we compare old beaches to new, when we match fossils across seas that were not yet seas, we feel the slow choreography settling into its shape. We take a step and count it, 1 minute turned into one footprint, and then imagine that step repeated until the room becomes a shoreline, then a map, then a line we can draw with a finger across an atlas at dusk. The hour holds what the hand can do. The eon holds what the world can become. Both are honest if we allow them their difference. A family remembers a house, a street, a story told on a winter night. The continent remembers a rift that opened and found an ocean in the space between two unhurried goodbyes. Is it possible to hold these at once without confusion, to let the small stay blessed and the large stay calm? The answer does not speak. It sits with us and becomes more comfortable the longer we share a breath. Sometimes the drift is a friend we notice only by what it leaves behind. A volcanic line that grows older and quieter along its length, an arc of islands that bows toward a trench, a mountain belt that points to a vanished sea. We read paleomagnetism like a compass kept in rock, iron cooled under an old sky pointing toward poles that wandered with the planet's own long mood. We do not need precise numbers tonight to trust the direction. It is enough to feel a continent slip a few centimeters in a year, and to know that the year will repeat itself many times without asking us to follow. We slow even more and look for something that matches our bodies. A tree ring holding a drought beside a generous summer. A stalagmite recording a century of rain with a bright and dim pattern. A tide putting its hand on the same stone twice a day. These are human-scale echoes of mantle-scale rhythms, loops inside loops that never quite close because each return is a little different. Entropy is here, smoothing edges and blending boundaries. Order returns too, in the insistence of cycles that prefer to be recognized. What if our task is simply to notice a little longer, to let the repeat become music and the drift become a lullaby we can live inside? We let a thought cross the room at the speed of a plate. A city now at one latitude will, across enough nights, lean into a gentler winter or a brighter spring. A desert will drift under a monsoon's glove or slide into a cooler, quieter rain. A reef will follow warmth until warmth learns a new path. Life adjusts because adjustment is life's way of staying. When an ocean opens, new corridors of current and wind are drawn like pencil lines between ideas. When an ocean closes, those corridors are erased and redrawn as mountains that rain will read. Dust, steady as a breath, waits on the windowsill and on the plane and on the shelf edge, ready to enter any story that needs a small, faithful wait. We kneel with a fingertip in sand and think of the hour. We stand with an eye on the horizon and think of the eon. Both belong to us not as possessions but as rooms we are allowed to visit. Not because we earned them, but because the planet is generous with its scales. We can tend a garden that advances a few leaves each morning. We can also trust a shoreline that may step a mile in a lifetime without offense. Could it be that kindness is the element that binds these scales? That the same courtesy which lets a seedling try again tomorrow also lets a continent drift a fraction today and still find its companion ages hence? Night gathers in the corners, and attention softens into a field where details and distances share the same hush. We remember that supercontinents have formed and drifted apart without hurry, that their sutures healed into belts we can trace with fingertips on warm stone, that rivers wrote their history across both sides of those old joins before the ocean introduced itself between them. The mind relaxes at this largeness because largeness here is gentle. It needs nothing from us but a willing ear. The heart finds room in a thought that does not jostle. Everything moves, and nothing is asked to move quickly. And yet, if drift can be this tender, if space can be given without loss and time can be kept without haste, what comfort might be found in the silences between impacts, the long intervals when the world rearranges itself in whispers and even the rare bright stone from the sky becomes a footnote in a book that continues in calm? Perhaps the next soft page is to lean into that quiet, to sit with the spaces where nothing seems to happen, and to feel how much of the planet's keeping is done in rest. We set the room to quiet and let the planet breathe. Most days in geologic time are simply days. Rivers sorting grains by weight, wind lifting dust and laying it down in a softer key, microbes teasing iron from stone, shells thickening and falling like gentle snow. Not because nothing happens, but because what happens is patient, the kind of work that prefers rhythm to spectacle. The continents carry the melody through these measures, their keels steady under weather's soft percussion, their shelves keeping time with tides that neither rush nor delay. Every so often, A different note arrives, sudden and bright. A bolide enters the air like a forgotten punctuation mark falling back into a sentence. Heat flowering in a second. Shock waves pressing patterns into the crust that no tide could write. Sky chemistry pauses and reconsiders. Dust learns to dim the noon. Oceans taste a new mixture and carry it forward in their overturning. Forests go quiet not because trees are fragile, but because sunlight is brief and seasons lose their footing for a while. Could it be that impacts are the planet's way of turning the page with a brisk hand, so that the next chapter can begin without tearing the book? Maybe, maybe not, and still the record shows a line of iridium where day became unusual, spherules strewn like beads where rock remembered heat and air, shocked quartz holding a frozen flinch in its lattice, the crystal-level echo of a shout. After the shout, the room returns to breath. Mantle flows, stirred by the sudden redistribution of weight, resume their slow convective phrases. Subduction continues its low conversation at the trenches. Volcanic arcs consider the new stress and answer in time with altered cadence. Life tests shapes in the pause after loss, the way a hand tests light after leaving a theater. Small leaves first, then brighter ones, shells thickening in cooler water, bones learning another way to run. The continents do not argue. They keep the key. Let rivers reopen their mouths. Let deltas extend their fingers again. Let soil rebuild its quiet black from what fell and what returned. Entropy hums. Order finds new edges to hold. We kneel in front of a road cut where the silence is visible. Thin beds of clay and silt stack as if the air itself had learned calligraphy. Then a darker line, just a breath of night pressed into noon, carries the signature of a sky that changed its mind, ash fused to memory in a tight band. Above, the rhythm resumes, familiar as a heartbeat in sleep. Fossils blink out and then blink in with different eyes. Pollen shifts to a new alphabet. The river's sand remembers the mountain even after the mountain has rested. And isotopes whisper that temperature remembered how to lean again toward seasons. Not because resets are gentle, but because what follows them can be. There are smaller stones from the sky that write in lowercase. Fractured bowls in the desert varnish, glass tears scattered on a plain. A circular bruise the forest heals with a ring of different trees. Each mark is a lesson in proportion. We learn that size is not the same as significance, and that significance is not the same as permanence. The shock that seemed to end a story becomes a hinge. The hinge becomes a way to open the next room. The room, when we enter it, is furnished with the quiet we missed. Is it possible that the truest surprise of impacts is how quickly the slow work remembers itself? How faithfully rivers pick up their sentences as if they had set them down on purpose? Between these rare flashes, the silence is full. Plate boundaries murmur. Earthquakes tidy old promises and set new ones. Dunes rewrite their ridges by millimeters. Stalagmites keep counting the sum of drips. A glacier inches while the valley it carves learns to welcome a lake that does not yet exist. The continents hear the long rest and move within it. Rafts drifting a few centimeters, then a few more, until latitudes switch partners and wind learns another dance. Dust, waiting without complaint, enters and leaves every room. Always useful, always able to become part of a page. We stand at the rim of a known crater at dusk and feel the scale resolve into calm. The bowl holds water when it rains. Frogs lay eggs at its edge. Sedges write thin green lines across the shallow. Dragonflies stitch the air, unconcerned with the origin of their pond. The shock is history. The shore is today. We do not have to reconcile them. The place does that for us by existing, by allowing the terrible and the tender to share the same coordinates without argument. In the far archives of the deep, thin layers record these moments and the long spaces around them with equal courtesy. Spherules gleam under a microscope like beads of night. Then 1,000 years of ooze returns the page to gray. Then a brighter stripe of ash speaks of a volcano whose name no one will know. Then the steady snow of shells resumes. There is comfort in the ordinariness of endurance. Not because we prefer quiet to change, but because we learn that quiet is a form of change. An inclusion rather than an absence, the steady leafing of time into texture. We let the chapter end as it began, with breath. Now and then, a stone from elsewhere writes a sudden mark. More often, The long silence of steady work sets the world in order without making a sound. We accept both note and rest. The continents carry the melody through the quiet, and when the bright strike comes, they carry it through that too, so that the song remains the song. And yet, if a single line can hold both thunder and whisper, if the ledger keeps the shock and then the hush, what distant pulse might already be assembling in the dark, inviting shores to part and meet again, softly, as the night turns another patient page? We lower our attention into the mantle's quiet where heat moves like thought, unhurried and sure, and listen for the hum of futures not yet drawn. Models suggest possibilities in careful voices. Amasia gathered across the top of the world, Pangea Ultima clasped again near the equator. Assembled by currents we can barely feel and only glimpse through echoes and ratios, through the slow bending of plates we will not live to see close. Not because destiny is written, but because warmth climbs, coolness sinks, and continents, light and thick, are persuaded by these gentle hands. Could it be that tomorrow's map is already rehearsing beneath our feet? Not as a plan but as a tendency, a soft leaning of stone toward stone? We let the scenarios pass like lanterns on a river at night. In one, the Arctic narrows as rafts drift inward, and northern shores become neighbors under a long summer sky. In another, the Atlantic grows tired of its breath and begins to close along old lines where it once opened, sutures remembering their own convenience. Maybe, maybe not, and still we hear how the engine would speak. Ridges subtle in their push, trenches steady in their pull, slabs folding like letters into deeper rooms, plumes lifting like quiet candles in places that will one day matter. The names we try on, Amasia, Pangea Ultima, are lullabies for possibilities, respectful of how much remains unknown, grateful that uncertainty can be a companion rather than a storm. We picture the continents as slow walkers in a dark hall, hands finding the banister by memory. Their keels feel the low terrain of the mantle, cool tongues that invite approach, warm columns that part them and then, later, gather them back. Oceans listen too, rearranging their currents with each small shift, and climate answers in kind. Deserts slide, forests climb, reefs rethread their bright stone along new shelves. Is it possible that the next supercontinent is less an event than a series of welcomes, arches of mountains stitched where coasts once rested, deltas folded into plains, old margins made into interiors that will remember salt only in fossils and subtle chemistry? We rest in the humility of inference. No instrument can promise the exact path. No equation can fully hold a world that edits itself while we write. What we have is patience and pattern. The Wilson cycle's long inhale and exhale, the preference of buoyant crust to endure, the habit of stress to reuse familiar corridors, the way zircon keeps honest time in sand that will long outlive us. Dust will gather where heat and chance agree. It has done so before under skies that tasted different, over seas that no longer breathe, and it will do so again, making new keels from old scripts, new shelves from old waves, new rooms for weather to speak softly in a changed vocabulary that still understands rain. We imagine standing on a quiet shore 100 million years from now, the air speaking a similar grammar in a different accent. Mountains beyond the horizon will be young and certain. The river at our feet will carry zircons that count from a past we can almost name. The wind will move through strange trees that know the sun as ours do, and the ocean will strike the sand with the same syllable, even as the map has folded itself into a different kindness. Entropy continues, smoothing, blending, inviting heat to spread. Order returns in layers, in sutures, in arcs, in archives that will stand upright as cliffs for whoever comes with unhurried eyes. Maybe the most faithful constant is the willingness of rock to remember and of water to restore. In the dark below, future continents are already humming, not loudly, not desperately, but with the composure of a system that keeps its promise by repeating, differently, what has worked before. A current strengthens, another loosens. A slab finds its quiet ramp. A plume's head flowers far below and waits an epoch to be noticed. The rafts above drift a finger's width in a year, no more dramatic than breath in sleep, and yet the sum of that breath is a coast rearranged, a climate moved, a forest invited to a new address. We listen without needing to finish the picture. The kindness is that the world works whether or not we see the whole. And yet, if the next gathering is already underway, If the maps to come are speaking in warmth and weight rather than in the language we draw with pens, what small certainties can we hold in our hands tonight? What simple, steady promises of stone and tide, while we let the rest remain open, like a window tilted to the night, so the future can enter at its own unhurried pace. We let that window breathe, and in its draft we feel ourselves, brief as weather, crossing a granite hill that has learned to keep its temper. Rain arrives, stays a while, writes its silver across lichen and quartz, then passes, and the hill remains, a patient archive of soft changes adding up to form. Not because the hill rejects us, but because it includes us the way a ledger includes every small entry, the thunder and the hush, the footstep and the cloud, until the sum becomes a landscape that never needed to raise its voice. We are made of travelers' dust and cooling stars, arranged by time into a body that can notice the ground and thank it without a word. Could it be that knowing how continents formed from cosmic ash teaches not triumph but tenderness? The willingness to move like a river that remembers its banks even as it changes them? Maybe, maybe not, and yet our days feel kinder when we match their scale to what endures. A single seed tucked into soil that took a century to darken. A stone carried from the path and set where water can rest. A window open to the evening so the room can trade breath with the world that made it. The hour is ours. The eon is not. Still, they meet in a glass of rain left on a sill, in a quiet attention that does not ask to be large. We are brief as weather, but weather shapes mountains, not by force alone, but by repetition that refuses to hurry. Entropy loosens, yes, and in loosening it makes room for what comes next. Roots entering a crack, frost practicing its careful wedge. A thin film of clay from feldspar's softened memory offering a home to a new root hair that will hold a slope against a sudden storm. We do not need to scale our lives to eras to matter. We can scale our care to cycles we can keep. Water carried and returned, heat shared and spared, dust allowed to settle where it nourishes rather than smothers. What if gentleness is the only technology that ages well, because it aligns with the world's longest habits? There is humility in the isotope's clock and the shoreline's breath, and that humility fits us like night air. We can count without rushing. We can measure without owning. We can read the low handwriting of shells and the quiet algebra of half-lives and learn a simple grammar. Leave room, share pace, return what cannot be kept. Maybe the most faithful sentence we can add to the planet's long paragraph is small and repeated. Thank you, and again, thank you, until the hillside hears us as drizzle and remembers our presence as a soft brightening of moss. Some evenings the sky performs its slow subtraction and we feel our edges dissolve a little into the wider dusk. Loss happens. History thins in places. Names fray like ropes that have done their work. Self-erasure is part of the script. One layer becoming another, one story resting beneath a newer one. But erasure here is not contempt. It is promise, a way to make space. Fossils lie down for cliffs we will not see. Forests open their canopies for the next weather. Rivers surrender old channels for fields that will one day be read in stone. We can join this exchange gladly, giving up what must pass so the pattern can stay whole. And if we seek a vow that holds, it may be this, to notice. To be the animal that looks and listens, that sets a palm on a shield's warm rib at dusk and recognizes in that heat the patience of decay turned to comfort. To be the guest who learns the house, where the wind enters, where the light rests, where the floor needs no weight. If dust is learning a new word in us, we can let the word be careful. Not because carefulness rescues worlds, but because it honors the ones that rescue themselves by taking their time. We pass like a rainstorm, and the hill remains, altered by our brief cool, its lichens a shade brighter, its pores rinsed, its channels practicing for larger weather. By knowing how continents rose from dust, how oceans chose their shores, how zircons kept the morning and soils taught it to return, we learn how to step lightly and to leave quietly, how to fold our small care into a large patience. The world answers with calm, not as reward, but as nature, the way a tide answers the moon without praising or scolding. And yet, if calm can be this generous, if the hill can keep its promise through storms and silence alike, what other promises might still be waiting in the dark below our feet, asking only that we slow down enough to hear them form? We come back to the first question by a softer path. as if returning to a room after years and finding the chair warmed by sunlight and the dust floating in a way that feels like greeting. What if continents remember dust? And what if dust remembers the long patience that made us possible? Not because stone thinks, but because pattern endures. Not because time speaks, but because arrangement holds. Not because we deserve a record, but because matter keeps one when it is given enough quiet to do so. The world has shown us its ledgers, zircon sparks counting mornings, shells balancing temperatures in the curve of their spirals, soils turning granite into seedbed, and those ledgers hum with a single refrain. Memory is structure, and structure is a kind of care. We look across the long table of what we have touched, the nebular dust that gathered by calm insistence, the fire that sorted stone into core and mantle and crust, the cratons holding posture like elder bones, the mantle's slow thunder moving rafts of granite through a warm, dark sea. Could it be that everything we've called wonder is merely recognition, a body remembering the grammar of its own beginning, the way a river recognizes a channel on first sight? Maybe, maybe not, and still the feeling persists, like the faint taste of old rain in a crystal's trapped breath. That matter has learned to keep its notes where they will be found by anyone who enters quietly, that dust settles not to forget but to prepare the next page. We hold the simplest images at arm's length and let them steady the room. A leaf pressed into shale like a sigh with edges, a trilobite's track stilled mid-thought, a strand line lifted to a terrace where hawks read thermals instead of tides. A zircon the size of a whisper, holding a number that will not hurry. Each is small, and smallness is the comfort. We do not need to gather everything. We need only to let a few steady things gather us. When we carry a stone in a pocket, we are not weighing ourselves down. We are remembering the lightness of time that doesn't demand attention to pass. Identity in this world is both patient and porous. A mountain keeps its story while turning itself into rivers. A continent holds its keel while accepting new edges. A coastline erases with grace so archives can thicken where marsh and tide agree. Entropy loosens, yes, but in loosening it creates space for repetition, and repetition is where memory finds a home. We can live by this, not because permanence is promised, but because pattern is probable, and probability is gentle when we meet it with care. What if our best addition to this long choir is not volume, but tuning, learning to lean our days toward the keys the planet already prefers? We leave open loops on purpose. What new isotopes will reveal when instruments steady their breath even more? What pores in rock will surrender the taste of a sky we haven't imagined? What future shores will lean into new winds without asking permission? What fossils will rise in the sun of a far morning and be understood by minds that have learned another vocabulary for tenderness? Maybe the next supercontinent will clasp where we cannot yet point. Maybe it will not. Maybe zircons in a river tomorrow will carry a number that asks a better question than ours. Curiosity walks ahead with a lantern, and we are content to follow at a pace that lets the path speak. We, brief as weather, are not outside this keeping. We are dust that learned the trick of noticing. We are ash that learned to measure. We are silt that learned to lift its head and promise to set it down gently. If continents are long, quiet songs, perhaps we are a harmony so soft it can be carried without strain. A cup of water returned to soil. A night window tilted to let cooler air exchange with the day. A hand on old stone, leaving nothing but warmth behind. Not because small gestures change the map, but because the map is made of small gestures arranged over time until they become a form. We ask little and the world answers with calm. A tide keeps its appointment. A cave counts without complaint. A glacier inches and the valley writes a fluent U without a raised voice. In these, kindness is not sentiment but geometry, the fit between force and form that prevents harm by acknowledging limits. To move with the same steady grace is to accept that pace is a choice as meaningful as direction, that slowness is not a lack but a technique, that quiet is not absence but depth. May dust remember that we listened, that we stood where a shield's warm rib met evening, and said nothing louder than thank you, that we read the shell's arithmetic without demanding answers faster than wavelengths can fold themselves into crystal, that we accepted darkness as a room where maps are drawn by echoes and patience, and did not strike matches where listening would do. Could it be that this is how memory in matter meets memory in mind, by agreeing on silence long enough for detail to appear? Maybe, maybe not. and the perhaps is a kindness all its own. Before we turn out the light, we bring back the first question and set it down where it can sleep. What if continents remember dust, and dust remembers us? If matter keeps memory through pattern, then we may add one pattern worth keeping. A way of moving that does not bruise what holds us up. A way of asking that does not rush what must be slow to be true. A way of leaving that adds to the ledger instead of smudging it. We close the window but leave the latch soft, so the night can return when it wants. We place the stone back on the sill and let it keep warming in the last thin light. May we move with the same steady grace. May we be brief and generous like weather passing over granite, leaving clearer air and a quieter face behind. May dust, when it settles into future pages and is lifted into future cliffs, remember this small attention as a contour in the long line. A light pressure, a held breath, a pause before words that made the words kinder. And yet, if tomorrow has another promise waiting in the dark, may we wake as listeners, carry it softly, and let it return to the shelf without a mark louder than patience.